Welcome, friends, to the History of the World channel. I am your narrator, Ramis. Enjoy listening to the full history of the country of Ukraine. Do not forget to write your opinion in the comments, and we will proceed. The history of Ukraine is the events on the territory of modern Ukraine, from the moment of the beginning of human settlement to the present. Stone tools about 4 million years old from a site in the village of Korolevo in the Transcarpathian region are the oldest reliably dated traces of the presence of Homo humans in Europe. Grain exports from the northern Black Sea region to Greece have been known since the 5th century BC. In the IV century AD, at the beginning of the Great Migration of Peoples, the steppes of the northern Black Sea region were occupied by Turkic tribes. In the 7th to 8th centuries, Slavic tribes settled in the Dnieper region. In the 8th century, a plough appeared, and fortified settlements of the local nobility appeared en masse. Since the 9th century, the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks has been developing, during which new tribal alliances have been formed, and Kievan Rus has been formed. In 860, Prince Askold of Kiev made his first campaign against Byzantium. In 882, after the murder of the Kiev princes, Oleg became the ruler, regent. Kievan Rus under the minor prince Egor. Under Sviatoslav, the power of the Kievan princes extended to all the East Slavic tribes. Under Vladimir, Christianity was adopted from Byzantium as the state religion, 9882. Under Yaroslav the Wise, starting in 1016, a code of laws was formed, Russian Truth. The rights of the local dynasties were recognized at the Lubeck Congress, and after 1132, the collapse of Kievan Rus became irreversible. Feudal and political fragmentation greatly weakened Kievan Rus. After the Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1240, the principalities became dependent on the Golden Horde. In 1362, the Lithuanian prince Algirdas, having defeated the armies of the Golden Horde in the Battle of the Blue Waters, finally incorporated most of the appanage principalities to the Black Sea into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Polish kingdom annexed the Galician and Kolm lands, finally in 1387. After the Union of Lublin in 1569, Volhynia, Podlasie, Podolia, Bratslav region, and Kiev region came under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During the 16th century, 3 Lithuanian statutes were created. In 1596, the Brest Union of the Orthodox Church of the Kiev metropolis with the Catholic Church caused the conversion to Greek Catholicism of part of the Western Russian nobility. In 1648, the Zaporozhian Cossacks rebelled under the leadership of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. In 1654, the Pereyaslav Rada was convened, which declared the transfer of territories controlled by the rebels under the protectorate of Russia. After the partitions of Poland, right bank Ukraine, Volhynia and Podolia became part of the Russian Empire in 1772-1795. After the collapse of the Russian Empire, the autonomous Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed on November 20th, 1917, and the Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets was proclaimed in Kharkov in December 1917. On January 9th, 1918, the UPR declared independence. The revolution and the Civil War ended with the establishment of Soviet power and the formation of the Ukrainian SSR, which occupied most of the territory of modern Ukraine. Western Ukraine was divided between Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. In 1922, the Ukrainian SSR became one of the founding states of the USSR. In the fall of 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, Western Ukraine was occupied by the Red Army and annexed to the Ukrainian SSR by the USSR and Germany. In 1940, by agreement with Romania, the southern part of Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, and the Herza region were annexed to the Ukrainian SSR. At the same time, a significant part of the abolished Moldavian ASSR was transferred to the newly formed Moldavian SSR from the Ukrainian SSR. In 1945, Transcarpathia was incorporated into Ukraine. In 1948, the Black Sea island of Zmaini was transferred from Romania to the Ukrainian SSR. In 1954, the Crimean region was transferred from the RSFSR to the Ukrainian SSR. After the August coup in Moscow, on August 24, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR declared Ukraine's independence. On December 1st in 1991, an all-Ukrainian referendum was held, and the question, "Do you confirm the act of declaring independence of Ukraine?" was included in the ballot. The turnout for the referendum in the Republic was 84. 18, 31,000 ranked 91,642 people, of which 90, 32 answered, "Yes, I confirm," and 7, 58, "No, I do not confirm." In 1994, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom signed the Budapest Memorandum, according to which Ukraine renounced nuclear weapons in favor of Russia in exchange for guarantees of territorial integrity. In 2004 and 2014, color revolutions took place in Ukraine. In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In April 2014, an armed conflict began in eastern Ukraine, which escalated into a large-scale invasion by Russia on February 24, 2022. Formation of statehood coupling from the series The History of the Army of Ukraine. Oleg the Prophetic Warrior, X Century, People's Militia, Buen Thin Century, Sagittarius from Nadros, Nowalthik Century, Horseman Danil Galitsky, Thin Century, Ukrainian Post, 2004, Artist Yuri Logvin. The formation of Ukrainian statehood is the subject of discussion between Russian and Ukrainian historical narratives. Some Russian scientists attribute its origin to the middle of the 17th century, the creation of the Zaporozhian army, or to 1917, the creation of the Ukrainian People's Republic, while Ukrainian to the end of the 9th century, the formation of Kievan Rus. The Ukrainian historian of the beginning of the 19th century M.S. Hrushevsky put forward the theory that the Kievan state was created by the Ukrainian Russian nation, the Vladimir Moscow state was created by another great Russian state, and the successors of the Kievan state were the Galician Volyn Principality, and further Ukraine 8. There is also a widespread view in Ukrainian historiography that the history of the Ukrainian state originates not from Kievan Rus, formed in 882 by the merger of northern and southern Rus, but from the Principality of Kiev, founded by the legendary Ki, Shchek, and Koriv. It is confirmed by written evidence and generally recognized in science the existence of political education in the Middle Dnieper region with its center in Kiev before the arrival of the chroniclers Askold, Dir, and Oleg, but not earlier than the first half of the 9th century. 1011. Southern Russia arose before the political formation of Rurik in the north, and as a result of its merger with Prince Oleg, formed Kievan Rus. In comparison with the northern entity, southern Russia had a more advantageous trade and military strategic location. The existence of the Cossack state in the 17th century and the date of its creation are also being questioned. According to a number of researchers, the processes that took place in the Hetman lands during the period of Russian patronage allow us to consider their power structures through the prism of statehood. Thus, the Russian historian Tatiana Tairova-Yakovleva in her works calls the Hetmanate a Ukrainian state, mainly characterizing it as a Cossack state. Such Ukrainian historians as Valery Smoly and Valery Stepankov expressed the opinion that the Hetmanate functioned as a state association, as a Christian Cossack republic, and the Ukrainian state of the time of Khmelnytsky was a republic with pronounced democratic features. Stepankov believes that at the beginning of the Liberation War, Khmelnytsky did not strive for the independence of Ukraine and remained in the position of autonomy until the middle of 1648. The idea of statehood was formed in the first half of 1649, and the Cossack state is considered the heir of Kievan Rus. Tairova-Yakovleva also believes that the Cossack statehood originated only in the winter of 1648-1649, when the Hetman's army returned to Ukraine, 1516. In turn, Maxim Yaremenko in Ukrainian. He argues that the foundations of the constitutional system, the Cossack Rada, and the election of officials could not develop sufficiently, which Smoly disagrees with, believing that the construction of the Ukrainian state was completed by the formed administrative territorial structure, Cossack courts, financial authorities, military and hierarchical political institutions. Prehistoric and ancient periods. The first human settlements appeared on the territory of Ukraine in the early Paleolithic era. The pebble industries of sites on the southern coast of Crimea, such as Eshkidag, Gaspra, etc., belong to the Olduvai culture. The Acheulean culture, more than 800,000 BC, includes layers 6th, 7th of the Korolevo site near the village of Korolevo, Transcarpathian region 18, and possibly the Neporotovo Sikin site on the right bank of the Dniester River near the village of Neporotovo, Sokiriansky district, Chernivtsi region. Settlement occurred from west to east in repeated waves and lasted up to 100,000 years ago. The tools of these people, archaeologists assume that they were pithecanthropists, were discovered in Transcarpathia, Transnistria, the Zhytomyr region, and the Donbass. However, no fossils of Homo erectus have been found. In the Middle Paleolithic, during the so-called Mousterian culture, 135,000 BC, the territory of Ukraine was occupied by Neanderthals. Researchers have discovered more than 300 Neanderthal sites and burials, mainly in the mountainous regions of Transcarpathia, the Carpathian region, the Upper Volga region, and the Crimea. Homo sapiens sites belong to the late Paleolithic. Vais, Mezinskaya, Pushkari Y, Stinka, Mira, Meziritskaya, Kievo-Kirillovskaya, Novgorod-Severskaya, Chulatovo, Ajikoba I-23, and others. More than 10,000 years ago, there was a transition from the late Paleolithic to the Mesolithic, which coincided with the melting of the glacier in the Pleistocene and the beginning of a new geological epoch, the Holocene. Global warming, population increase. However, the crisis of the appropriating Mesolithic economy gradually forced people to start reproducing forms, agriculture, and cattle breeding. This contributed to the invention of ceramics. A new Neolithic era began, which lasted for 4 millennia BC. The landscape division of Ukraine into forest, forest steppe, and steppe zones has stabilized, and the humus cover of the earth has been formed. The Neolithic cultures of Ukraine were shaped by the achievements of Middle Eastern cultures, which were imported mainly through the Balkan Peninsula and the Danube region. In the Subneolithic, part of the modern territory was occupied by the Dnieper-Donetsk culture. It was replaced by the Srednestoga culture. The period of the Eneolithic, Copper Age, and the Neolithic is represented by the agricultural and pastoral Tripilian culture. Monuments of the Yamnaya culture of the 2 millennia BC are found on the territory of Ukraine, which later gave way to the Catacomb and Middle Dnieper cultures. Around 1500 BC, nomadic tribes appeared on the territory of Ukraine. One of them was the Cimmerians, 9th-7th centuries BC, who are mentioned in written sources. The Scythians, an Iranian-speaking people from Central Asia, displaced the Cimmerians from the Ukrainian steppes in the 7th century BC. Around the same period, the Greeks began to establish the first colonies in the northern Black Sea region. The Scythians created the first centralized state on the territory of Ukraine. Around 200 BC, the Scythians were displaced by the Sarmatians. For the period of the Bronze Age, the territories of the southwestern part are characterized by the Belogrudov culture. The Zarubinets culture is characteristic of the northwest of the Kiev region in the second half of the 1st millennium BC, the first half of the 1st millennium AD. The Iron Age in the territory of modern Kiev and the Kiev region is represented by the Chernyakovsk archaeological culture, which is also called the Kiev culture, and which existed at the turn of the Tsexaint. Third, the turn of the Ivev, 5 centuries. In the 3rd century AD, the Goths moved to the territory of Ukraine, where they established their kingdom, the second state entity on the territory of Ukraine. In 375, the Goths were defeated by the Huns, who, according to a number of sources, formed an alliance with the Slavic tribes of the Antes and Sclavians and moved to the west. The power of the Huns, having suffered several defeats from the Romans and their allies, quickly loses its strength and disintegrates. After the invasion of the Huns, control over the territory of Ukraine passed to the Slavic tribes of the Ants and Sklavins, represented respectively by the Penkovsky, also partially Kolochinsky, and Prague-Korchak archaeological cultures. At the end of the 7th century, the Prague-Korchak culture in the eastern part of its range was replaced by the Luka-Rashkovets culture, Rashkovets settlement, which existed until the end of the 9th century (2). In the second half of the 1st millennium, part of the territory of Ukraine was part of the Avar Khaganate, and later most of the territory became dependent on the Khazar Khaganate, Saltovo-Mayak archaeological culture. In the second half of the first millennium, the Slavic tribes on the territory of modern Ukraine included the Polyans, Drevlians, Northerners, Bujans, Tvertsi, Ulichi, Volhynians, and others. Kievan Rus, 8628-882-1240. In the 7th century, a large and well-fortified settlement of Plesnesk was built by a union of East Slavic tribes on the territory of western Volhynia, possibly by the Dulebs, Volhynians or Croats, in the upper reaches of the Western Bug, at the headwaters of the Seret, from which a hill fort with a burial mound surrounded by a system of earthen ramparts and ditches with a total length of about 7 kilometers, an area of about 300 hectares in Nayek's X centuries. It is the largest monument of ancient Russian fortifications. A large number of unique finds attest to the connections of Plesnensk of this time with Great Moravia and the Pomeranian Slavs, early Christianity already in the 9th century, fortification construction, and the development of handicrafts. A trade route passed through Plesnesk, connecting the future Kiev with Great Moravia and Germany. There was also a pagan cult center in Plesnes. At the turn of the 7th and 8th centuries, Kiev on the Dnieper, in comparison with the synchronous pastoral settlement, was an ordinary settlement in terms of socio-economic development and could not be a tribal center, however, as in the subsequent Volintsevo period. After the collapse of Great Bulgaria, in the second half of the 7th century, the Bulgarians remaining in the northern Black Sea region, led by Batbayan, fell under the rule of the Khazars. For about 2 or 3 centuries, in the 7th, 10th centuries, there continued a multiple influx of numerous groups of Slavic immigrants from the Moravian Danube region to various areas of the Eastern European plain, already mastered by the Slavs, which played a significant role in consolidating the Slavic population of Eastern Europe, and culminated in the formation of the ancient Russian nationality. In the 9th, early 11th century, the town of Stolsko, surrounded by powerful earthen ramparts and moats, existed in Upper Transnistria, with an area of 250 hectares. Kiev then had an area of 9 to 7 hectares. In the 9th to 13th centuries, there was a Zbruch cult center in Medobori on the banks of the Zbruch River, which had a complex structure and consisted of 3 sanctuary towns, Bokit, Zvenigorod, Govda, on the right bank of the Zbruch, and possibly 1 sanctuary on the left bank of the Zbruch, Ivankovtsi, Zamchishcha tract. After the destruction of the settlements of the Volintsevo culture at the beginning of the 9th century, by the middle of the 9th century, the basins of the Sula, Vorskla, and Desna were empty. The northerners of the Romansk culture concentrated in the upper reaches of the Sele and in the Posami. The bearers of the Onion Raikovets culture come to the thoroughly sparse area of the meadows on the right bank of the Dnieper River, creating a fortified settlement in Kiev. The period from 882 to the first quarter of the 10th century includes the reconstruction of Kiev, the founding of Vyshgorod, Chernigov and Lyubech, and the formation of the ancient Russian settlement system of Nizhny Podolsyn. In the 10th century, twisted silver earrings, rolled grain pendants of headdresses and necklaces, and buttons spread to the east under the influence of Great Moravia. In the middle of the 10th century, Iskorosten, Gorodishche Thepwefsyn, was destroyed. Synchronously with Iskorosten, the ancient settlement of the Luka Raikovets culture monastery is dying. After the defeat of the Drevlians in 945 and 946, the old Russian colonization began on the right bank of the Dnieper River, aimed at the Slovachansk-Ovruchsky Ridge, which was not occupied by the population of the Luka Raikovets culture 39. In the second half of the 10th century, the traditions of the Luka Raikovets culture completely gave way to the complex of ancient Russian culture, including the appearance of inhumations. In the 9th to 10th centuries, after the liberation of the Dnieper lands by Prince Oleg the Prophetic from tribute to the Khazar Khaganate, the capital of the ancient Russian state under the rule of the Rurik dynasty was moved to Kiev. In terms of the nature and details of the funeral rites, the oldest Western-oriented corpses in Kiev and the Middle Dnieper region have direct analogies in early Christian monuments on the territory of Great Moravia in Skalice, Old Place, Mikulčice, Pogansko, near Brzeklav, Stara Kurzim, Kolinchek, and jelly beans. In 965, Sviatoslav Igorovich crushed the Khazar Khaganate. In 988, Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich of Kiev adopted Christianity from Byzantium and proclaimed it the state religion. Having concentrated all the Russian lands under his rule only 21 years after the death of his father, Yaroslav the Wise, dying in 1054, divided them among his 5 surviving sons. After the death of the 2 youngest of them, all the lands were concentrated in the hands of the 3 eldest, Izyaslav of Kiev, Sviatoslav of Chernigov, and Vsevolod Pereyaslavsky, the triumvirate of Yaroslavichi. After Sviatoslav's death in 1076, the Kievan princes attempted to deprive his sons of the Chernigov inheritance, and they resorted to the help of the Polovtsians, whose raids began as early as 1061, immediately after the defeat of the Turks by the Russian princes in the steppes. Although, for the first time, the Polovtsians were used in strife by Vladimir Monomakh against Vseslav Polotsky. Izyaslav of Kiev, 1078, and Vladimir Monomakh's son, Izyaslav, 1096, died in this struggle. At the Lübeck Congress, 1097, designed to end civil strife and unite the princes to protect them from the Polovtsians, the principle was proclaimed, "Let everyone keep his fatherland." Thus, while maintaining the right of succession, in the event of the death of one of the princes, the movement of heirs was limited to their patrimony. This made it possible to end the strife and join forces to fight the Polovtsians, who were moved deep into the steppes. However, this also opened the way to political fragmentation, as a separate dynasty was established in each land, and the Grand Duke of Kiev became the first among equals, losing the role of suzerain. In the second quarter of the 12th century, the United States broke up into independent principalities. The chronological beginning of the period of fragmentation is considered by the modern historiographical tradition to be 1132, when, after the death of Mstislav the Great, the son of Vladimir Monomakh, the power of the Kiev prince was no longer recognized by Polotsk, 1132, and Novgorod, 1136, and the title itself became the object of struggle between various dynastic and territorial associations of the Rurikids. The chronicler wrote in 1134, in connection with the split among the Monomakhovites, "The whole Russian land was torn apart." The civil strife that began did not concern the Grand Duchy itself, but after the death of Yaropolk Vladimirovich, 1139, the next Vyacheslav Monomakhovich was expelled from Kiev by Vsevolod Olgovich of Chernigov. Russia broke up into separate principalities, including, on the territory of modern Ukraine, the Principality of Kiev, partly the Principality of Chernigov, the Principality of Galicia, the Principality of Vladimir Volhynia, partly the Principality of Turov-Pinsk, as well as the Principality of Pereyaslav. In addition, at the end of the 15th and throughout the 13th century, raids by the Cumans became more frequent, replacing the Pechenegs who migrated to the Balkans. For many decades, the South Russian princes could not cope with the Polovtsians, having undertaken a number of unsuccessful campaigns and suffering severe defeats, the Battle of the Alta River, the Battle of the Stugna River, etc. The Polovtsians ravaged many Russian cities, often approaching Kiev itself, ravaged the Peschersk Lavra. Historians assume that during the 12th century, part of the population of the South Russian principalities, due to the constant threat emanating from the steppe, moved north to the more peaceful Rostov-Suzdal land, also called Zalesye or Opole. Immigrants from the populous south quickly became the majority on this land and assimilated the sparse Finnish population. Chronicles and archaeological excavations attest to the massive Russian migration during the 12th century. It was during this period that numerous cities of the northeast of Russia were founded and grew rapidly. Vladimir, Moscow, Pereyaslavl-Zaleski, Yuriev-Polski, Dimitrov, Zvenigorod, Starodub-on-Klyazma, Yaropolch-Zaleski, etc. The names of new cities were often copied from the names of cities in southern Russia. In 1169, Vladimir Monomakh's grandson, Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky of Vladimir and Suzdal, sent troops led by his son Mstislav, who captured Kiev. The city was brutally looted, the Kiev temples were burned, and the inhabitants were taken captive. In the 12th century, in addition to the Prince of Kiev, the title of Great was also worn by the princes of Vladimir. In the 13th century, also Ryazan, Galicia, and Chernigov. In 1199, Roman Mstislavich united the Galician and Volhynian principalities. His descendants finally established themselves in the Galician-Volhynian Principality in 1239. After the invasion of Batu, 1237-1241, and the devastation of 1299, Kiev fell into desolation. Since the 11th century, the territories south of the ancient Russian principalities were inhabited by nomadic Polovtsians 43. In the first half of the 13th century, these lands became part of the Golden Horde. Already in the second half of the 13th century, there was a difference in the position of individual principalities, which would determine their fate in the future. The situation of the principalities of the Ukrainian lands, Kiev, Pereyaslav, Chernigov, and Galicia-Volhynia, was largely determined by events even before the Mongol invasion. The 40-year War, 1205 to 1245, significantly depleted their forces. The borderlands of Kiev, Pereyaslav, and Chernigov-Seversk became easy prey for Batu. These principalities have lost the pace of evolution compared to their neighbors. The princely elite, terrorized by the Mongols, degraded, urban life declined, and the continuous fragmentation of principality lands intensified. In contrast, the Galician-Volyn princely branch, which emerged victorious from the War of 1205-1245, managed to lay the foundations of its own powerful state, which existed steadily for another century. As part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania for a long time included the Kiev, Chernigov, Volyn, and Galician lands. During the reign of Grand Duke Gediminas of Lithuania, 1316 to 1341, the territory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania grew. Minsk, Orsha, Brest, Pinsk, and Turov joined. Attempts were made to annex the Principality of Kiev, and the succession of princely power was established. In 1323, the last legitimate heirs of Roman Mstislavich in Galicia, Andrei and Leo II, died. This leads to the fact that the Galician inheritance passes to the Polish sovereign Yuri VI Boleslav. In 1340, Boleslav was poisoned, and Lubart Gediminovich, baptized under the name Dmitri, was invited to the prince's table by the boyars. In reality, the power of Lubart Demetrius was limited to Volhynia, and the capital was in Lutsk. In 1344-1345, after the campaign of the Polish king Casimir III, Galicia gradually came under Polish rule. The Polish kingdom finally captured the Galician and Kolm lands in 1387. At this time, weakened by the struggle against the Mongols and internal hardships, the Russian lands came to the attention of the Gediminovich dynasty. In 1362, during the reign of Prince Algirdas of Lithuania, the Principality of Kiev joined the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Gradually, Black Russia, White Russia, Chernigov, and Novgorod-Seversk principalities came under the rule of the Lithuanian Gedimin dynasty. It was a rather amorphous association, in which the Russian population and lands were the majority, namely 80 of the population, so the Lithuanian government was not repressive, and in fact it was a state with the Western Russian language as the state language and Orthodoxy as the main religion. Bukovina has been part of the Moldavian Principality under the name Shepin Land since 1359, and Transcarpathia returned to the Hungarian kingdom in the second half of the 13th century. Thus, in the 13th to 14th centuries, the Ukrainian lands became part of neighboring states. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, the Principality of Moldavia, and the Kingdom of Hungary. The local gentry supported the princes of Kestut, Vitoft, Svidrigailo in their struggle for the unification of all lands into one state. In the context of the struggle against the Crusaders, the Moscow Principality, and due to internal conflicts, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania entered into an alliance with the Polish kingdom, signing the Union of Kreva, 1385. Over the course of 100 years, 3 internal wars took place in the Lithuanian Principality. In 1381, in 1384, in 1389, in 1392, and in 1432-1439. Shvorn Danilovich, the son of King Daniel Romanovich, was the Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1267 to 1270. In 1325, Lithuanian Prince Gediminas defeated the Russian army of Prince Sviatoslav at the Irpin River and established a protectorate over the Principality of Kiev. Prince Lyubart Gediminovich of Vladimir Galician Russia. Lithuanian Prince Algirdas, having defeated the armies of the Golden Horde in the Battle of the Blue Waters in 1362, finally includes most of the Appanage principalities up to the Black Sea into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Polish kingdom seized the Galician and Kolm lands, finally in 1387. After the Union of Kreva in 1385, Polish and Catholic influences in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania increased, and the Orthodox Russian nobility gradually withdrew from power. In 1434, Lviv became the capital of the Russian voivodeship, which included 5 starosts with centers in the cities of Lviv, Holm, Sanok, Galich, and Przemysl. In 1456, the Principality of Volhynia was liquidated, and in 1470, the Principality of Kiev was liquidated. Konstantin Ivanovich Ostrogsky, 1460-1530, the Grand Hetman of Lithuania. The Battle of Orsha, Konstantin Konstantinovich Ostrogsky, 1526-1608. Ostrog Academy in Volhynia, 1576-1636. As a result of the Union of Lublin in 1569, which formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Volhynia, Podlasie, Podolia, Bratslav region, and Kiev region were transferred from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the Polish Kingdom. During the 16th century, 3 Lithuanian statutes were created. In 1596, the Brest Union of the Orthodox Church of the Kiev Metropolia with the Catholic Church caused the conversion of part of the Russian nobility to Catholicism. New Time Sloboda Ukraine. In the 16th century, the Russian state entered a phase of active expansion. Belgorod was built in the north of the Wild Field, 1596, around which the Belgorod line was formed with fortresses such as Akhturka, 1654, Ostrogozhsk, 1652. In 1658, Sumy entered the Belgorod region. Sloboda Ukraine, Slobozhanshkina, began to form south of the line as the Moscow government promised benefits to the settlers. A significant part of the settlers were the Cossack population of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who fled persecution. The Khmelnytsky Uprising. In the period 1591-1638, a number of Cossack and peasant uprisings took place, the purpose of which was to legitimize the Ukrainian Cossacks as one of the estates of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, strengthen the rights of the Orthodox Church, and weaken social oppression. In 1648, the Ukrainian Cossacks launched a large-scale uprising due to increased oppression by Polish magnates. The uprising was led by the former centurion of the registered Cossacks, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Initially, the Cossacks were successful. They were supported by the Crimean Khanate, which was then ruled by Islam III Garai. In the Battle of Yellow Waters, 1648, the Cossack Tatar army, the Cossacks were commanded by Khmelnytsky and the Crimeans by Tugay Bey, won its first victory, defeating the Polish detachment of Stepan Potocki. Victory in the Battle of Korsun, May 16th, 26, 1648, soon followed. By the end of July, the entire territory of the left bank was liberated from the Polish presence, and by the end of August, the Bratslav, Kiev, Podolsk, except Kamianets, voivodeships on the right bank, as well as the eastern and southern regions of the Volyn voivodeship. The liberation of the right bank is associated with the name of Maxim Krivonos, the leader of the Cossack and peasant detachments, one of Khmelnytsky's closest associates. On September 11th, 21-23, a victory was won near Pilyavtsi. Galicia became the scene of military operations in the fall, and the siege of Lviv began in October. Upon reaching Zamościa, the hetman began negotiations with the Polish government and concluded a truce with the newly elected King Jan II, Kazimierz, whose candidacy Khmelnytsky tacitly supported during the elections UKR-Rs. The victorious campaign of 1648 was completed. On December 23, 1648, January 2, 1649, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, at the head of a Cossack army, solemnly entered Kiev. In the territories liberated from the Poles, a Cossack-style management system was established. In particular, the regiments became units not only of the military, but also of the administrative territorial organization. The large magnate latifundia were de facto eliminated, and the peasants received the status of free inhabitants. In religious terms, the Orthodox Church has taken the dominant position. Office work was again conducted in the Western Russian, Old Ukrainian language. However, at the same time, mass repressions were carried out against groups of the population whom the rebels considered their oppressors and enemies: the Catholic clergy, Poles, large landowners, Jews. The mass extermination of the Jewish population of Ukraine during the Khmelnytsky uprising was called Gzerot Ta in Jewish culture, Hebrew Gzerot Ta. Often, the East Slavic Orthodox population also became victims of repression along the way. Bogdan Khmelnytsky demanded that the royal government recognize the autonomy of the Zaporozhian army in the territories it controlled. However, such a condition seemed unacceptable to the Poles. Therefore, the war continued in 1649. After the siege of Zbaraj by the Cossack Tatar troops on June 30th, August 12th, July 10th, August 22nd, 1649, and the short Battle of Zborovo on September 5th, 6th, 15/16, the Treaty of Zborovo was concluded, which recognized the hetman's authority and the jurisdiction of the Zaporozhian army over the territory of the Kiev, Bratslav, and Chernigov voivodeships, and the Polish gentry had no right to stay in these territories. This is how the state formation arose, which in later Ukrainian historiography was called the Hetmanate. Since the summer of 1648, Bogdan Khmelnytsky had been in correspondence with the Russian Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, informing him about the course of the uprising, the successes of his troops, and asking for military help in the fight against the Poles. However, no practical response was received to these requests until 1653. Khmelnytsky tried in every possible way to strengthen his foreign policy position, in particular by establishing relations with the Hetmanate's southwestern neighbors, Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldova, as well as their overlord, the Ottoman Empire. In particular, in 1650, Khmelnytsky concluded an agreement with Moldavian ruler Vasily Lupu on the marriage of his son Timofey with Lupu's daughter Rozanda, and when the ruler tried to withdraw from this deal, taking advantage of the defeat of the Cossack troops in the Battle of Berestechko, the hetman's army conducted a so-called wedding campaign to the capital of Moldova, Iasi, forcing Lupu to give up his daughter. For the son of Khmelnytsky, and to restore the alliance with the Zaporozhian army, Khmelnytsky seriously considered the prospect of transferring the lands under his control to the protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. In particular, more than one embassy was sent from Chigirin to Istanbul and back during the war. In 1653, the Sultan even sent sanjaks to the hetman, signs of his mercy and acceptance under the protection of the Porte. In the summer of 1651, the Battle of Berestey took place, as a result of which the Polish army led by King Jan II, Casimir and Nikolai Potocki inflicted a crushing defeat on the Cossacks. In August of the same year, Lithuanian hetman Janus Radziwill took Kiev. The unsuccessful campaign for Khmelnytsky resulted in the signing of the Bolotsakovsky Peace on September 18th, 28th, 1651, which narrowed the territory of the hetmanate only to the Kiev voivodeship. In the summer of the following year, the Cossacks took partial revenge for the defeat, surprising and defeating Polish troops in the Battle of Batog. Acceptance of the Russian Protectorate. By 1653, the tone of Khmelnytsky's letters to Moscow had changed. From requests for military assistance, he moved on to requests to take the Zaporozhian army under the protection of the Russian Tsar. In the summer of 1653, Timofey Smelnitsky died during the Suceava campaign, designed to help Bogdan Khmelnytsky's matchmaker Vasily Lup retain power, so the hetman's dynastic plans for the Danubian principalities lost their relevance. On October 1st, 1653, when Cossack troops were besieging Zhevanets, the Zemsky Sobor in Moscow decided to accept the Zaporozhian army, with cities and lands under the royal hand. On January 8th, in 1654, the General Military Council was held in Pereyaslav, which approved the adoption of Russian citizenship. The March Articles legally formalized the autonomous position of the Zaporozhian army within the Russian kingdom. Russia's acceptance of the Cossacks into citizenship led to the outbreak of another Russian-Polish war. In 1654, the regiments of the hetman Ivan Zolotarenko participated together with the Russian troops in the sovereign's campaign against Lithuanian Rus. The following year, the offensive began in Ukraine. The combined Tsarist hetman forces defeated the Poles near Okhmatov on January 1929, January 29th, February 1st, 1655, and besieged Lviv in the fall. The campaign was successful for the Russian Cossack troops, but there were contradictions between them. In particular, who, the Tsar or the hetman, should be sworn to by the population of the territories under control. In 1656, Sweden entered the war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which radically changed the balance of power in the Russian-Polish conflict. Swedish troops quickly captured almost the entire territory of the Polish lands with Warsaw and Krakow, as well as part of Lithuania, which went down in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as the Swedish Flood. Fearing the strengthening of Sweden, the Moscow government preferred to conclude a compromise truce with Poland on October 24th. November 3rd, 1656, directed against the Swedes. Bogdan Khmelnytsky accepted Moscow's reconciliation with his main opponent, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with deep dissatisfaction and, although he did not openly protest Alexei Mikhailovich, began to search for new allies in the fight against Poland. Just a month after the Truce of Vilna, using long-established contacts with the Swedes and the rulers of the Danubian principalities, on November 26th, December 6th, 1656, the hetman concluded an agreement with the Swedish King Charles II and Transylvanian Prince Georgi II. Rakoczy, according to which the Zaporozhian army, Sweden and Transylvania, were to, by conducting a military campaign to defeat the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and divide its territory among themselves. According to this treaty, the southeastern lands of the Polish kingdom, inhabited by Orthodox Russians, were to be ceded to the hetmanate. However, the Allied forces, despite significant military successes, could not achieve the main political goal of the campaign: the elevation of Georgi Rakoczy to the Polish throne, which was supposed to be the guarantor of the implementation of subsequent agreements. The ruin on July the 27th, August 6th, 1657, Bogdan Khmelnytsky died in his capital, Chaihyrin. According to the will of the deceased, the foreman elected his 16-year-old son, Yuri Khmelnytsky, as the new hetman, under whom Ivan Vygovsky, the general clerk of the Zaporozhian army, one of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's closest associates, was appointed regent. However, 2 months later, Yuri was dismissed from his post by the same foreman and sent to science in Kiev, and Vygovsky became a full-fledged hetman. In terms of foreign policy, he continued Bogdan Khmelnytsky's course of searching for alternatives to Russia in ensuring the sovereignty of the hetmanate. Even during his election, he testified to his commitment to alliance with the Swedish king, while simultaneously establishing contacts with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, the beginning of his hetmanate was marked by an outbreak of social discontent, which had been accumulating during the lifetime of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. The Cossack elders became the ruling class of the young state, which caused discontent among the social lower classes and the peasants who showed up. At the same time, some of the elders who remained loyal to the Russian Tsar were suspicious of Vygovsky's pro-Polish orientation. All this was the reason for the anti-hetman rebellion that broke out in late 1657 and early 1658 in left bank Ukraine, mainly by the forces of the Poltava Regiment and the Zaporozhian Sich. At the same time, both sides of the conflict declared their loyalty to the Moscow Tsar. In the summer of 1658, Vygovsky, calling on the help of the Crimean Tatars, stormed Poltava and defeated the centers of resistance throughout the territory of the Poltava Regiment. Russians were already openly opposed by Vygovsky at the end of the summer of 1658, besieging the Russian garrison in Kiev and concluding the Gadyatsky Treaty with the Polish government, according to which the territories controlled by the Zaporozhian army, hetmanate, were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as the third equal component, along with the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, under the name of the Grand Duchy of Russia, which the hetman, who was elected by the Cossacks for life, was supposed to be in charge. This gave the Moscow government a clear reason to accuse Vygovsky of treason and send troops to Ukraine. The demonstratively abrupt reversal of the hetman's foreign policy caused misunderstanding among some of the Cossacks, which was compounded by the brutal methods used by Vygovsky in the fight against the rebellious rabble, in particular during the suppression of the Poltava Rebellion. After the first skirmishes with the Tsarist army, in the autumn of 1658, Vygovsky testified loyalty to Russia. But in December, having joined forces with the Crimean Tatars and the Polish detachment of Andrei Potoki, Vygovsky resumed military operations, attacking the Russian troops in Lokvix and the Cossacks of Hetman Ivan Bespali, who remained loyal to Moscow, in Romny. On March 26th, April 5th, 1659, the Russian army of Prince Alexei Trubetskoy entered Ukraine, many times outnumbering the forces of Vygovsky and the Poles. But on June 28th, July 2nd, July 8th to 12th, the Tsarist army suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of Konotop. But Vygovsky failed to take advantage of the success achieved. Already in August, a number of cities of the Poltava regiment, as well as the Cossacks, rebelled against him. Soon, almost the entire left bank joined the rebellion. In this situation, Vygovsky resigned his hetmanate and handed over the Kleinods to Yuri Khmelnytsky, who returned from Kiev and whom the Rada elected hetman in September 1659. After becoming hetman, Yuri Khmelnytsky concluded the so-called Pereyaslav Articles with the Tsarist government, a falsified version of the March Articles, which Moscow officials presented to Yuri as an agreement concluded by his father in Pereyaslav in 1654. As part of the Russian troops under the command of Vasily Sheremetyev, the regiments of Yuri Khmelnytsky in 1660 took part in the offensive against the Poles in right bank Ukraine. However, when the Russians were defeated by Lyubar and Chudnov, Khmelnytsky capitulated near Slobodishche, and on October 17th, 1660, concluded a treaty with the Poles, according to which the hetmanate returned to the rule of the Polish crown. Basically, the treaty duplicated the Gadiaksky Treaty, but without the clause on the creation of the Russian Grand Duchy. If the Rada of the right bank regiments approved the conclusion of the Slobodishchensky Tract, then on the left bank it was accepted with dissatisfaction. In Pereyaslav, the people, led by the elected left bank hetman of Pereyaslav, Colonel Yakim Somko, uncle of Yuri Khmelnytsky, vowed to die for the great sovereign Tsar, for the churches of God, and for the Orthodox faith, and not to surrender the cities of Little Russia to the enemies, to stand against the enemies and hold the answer. Although formally Y. Khmelnytsky remained the hetman of the entire Zaporozhian army, in fact his authority was recognized only on the right bank. Ukraine is politically split along the Dnieper River line. In 1661 and 1662, Yuri Khmelnytsky unsuccessfully besieged Pereyaslav twice, trying, with the help of Poles and Tatars, to forcibly restore his power on the left bank. During the retreat from the city, his troops were defeated on July 16th, 1662, in the Battle of Kanev. However, the left bank regiments that penetrated the right bank on the shoulders of the retreating left bank regiments were also unsuccessful. At the end of the same year, Yuri Khmelnytsky renounced the hetmanate and retired to a monastery. Pavel Teteria became his successor in the post of right bank hetman. At the same time, the struggle for power escalated on the left bank, which remained under the protectorate of the Russian Tsar. The main contenders for the hetmanate were the punished hetman Yakim Somko, one of the main leaders of the defense of Pereyaslav, and the Nizinsky colonel Vasily Zolotarenko. However, Ivan Bryukovetsky, a candidate who was supported by the Zaporozhian Sit and the social grassroots, and who also managed to secure the patronage of the Moscow authorities, appeared on the political scene. By effectively manipulating public sentiment and using populist rhetoric, Bryukovetsky managed to gain the upper hand at the so-called Black Rada, held near Nizhyn on June 17th, 27-28, 1663, and become the left bank hetman. In the autumn of the same year, he concluded the Baturin Articles with the Tsarist government, which significantly expanded the powers of Russian dignitaries in the hetmanate. 2 years later, after repelling a large-scale Polish offensive, Bryukovetsky was the first of the hetmans to visit Moscow, where he concluded an agreement that further limited the hetman's rights in controlling the Zaporozhian army. At the end of 1663, the troops of King Jan II, Casimir and right bank hetman Pavel Teteri embarked on a large-scale campaign against left bank Ukraine. having achieved significant territorial successes, the Crown Army besieged Gluchov on January 11th, 1664. However, against the background of the prolonged siege, the left bank towns occupied by the king began to rise up in the rear. At the same time, an uprising broke out on the right bank. Under these conditions, due to the Russian Cossack armies approaching from different directions, the Crown Army retreated with heavy losses. Teteria was forced to return to the right bank and engage in a long struggle with various rebel groups led by representatives of the elders, and by the end of 1664, he renounced the hetmanate and left for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Pyotr Doroshenko became the new right bank hetman, who managed to suppress the opposition and gain recognition of his authority throughout the right bank. On January 30th, February 9th, 1667, the Andrusovo Armistice was signed, ending the Russian-Polish War. According to him, the parties recognized the Polish protectorate over the right bank and the Russian protectorate over the left bank. Russia was given 2 years to withdraw its garrison from Kiev and hand it over to the Poles. Later, however, it managed to hold it as a result of the Eternal Peace of 1686. The lands of the Zaporozhian Sich were supposed to be under the common patronage of both monarchs. The conclusion of the Andrusovo Truce caused violent indignation in the Zaporozhian army on both sides of the Dnieper. Right bank Hetman Doroshenko, having accumulated his forces and entered into an alliance with the Crimean Khanate, began a war against Poland at the end of 1666. However, having suffered defeat at Podgaitsi in October 1667, he was forced to recognize the authority of the Polish king and agree only to the symbolic autonomy of the territory of the right bank as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Andrusovo Truce, as well as the narrowing of the autonomy of left bank Ukraine by the Tsarist government with the direct support of Bryukovetsky, caused the beginning of the anti-Moscow uprising in the left bank regiments. At the same time, Bryukovetsky immediately supported the rebels, coming to the conclusion that a change in foreign policy orientation was necessary. An embassy is sent from the hetman's headquarters in Gadiak to Istanbul, and the left bank foreman, knowing about Doroshenko's close contacts with the Ottoman Empire, invites him to join left bank Ukraine. In June 1668, Doroshenko was proclaimed hetman of both banks of the Dnieper. Bryukovetsky had recently been executed by the rebellious rabble, but he could not maintain control on the left bank for a long time. To quell the next unrest, he was forced to return to right bank Ukraine, leaving Demyan Ignatovich Mnogoreshny, a colonel from Chernigov who supported Doroshenko as the hetman on the left bank. However, in the face of the offensive of the Moscow troops, as well as the uprisings that broke out in the southern left bank regiments, Mnogoreshny decided it was best to swear allegiance to the Russian Empire again. In March 1669, the Gluchov Articles were concluded, which somewhat expanded the scope of hetman's powers in the administration of Little Russia. In 1669, the right bank hetman, Pyotr Doroshenko, having failed in his attempts to unite the entire Zaporozhian army, accepted citizenship of the Turkish Sultan. In 1670, hostilities resumed on the right bank between Poles, Doroshenko's Cossacks, supporters of his opponents from among the elders. In particular, in 1671, the government of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth recognized the loyal Mikhail Kanenko as the hetman of the right bank, as well as Tatars. In 1672, Turkey, under the pretext of protecting its vassal Doroshenko from the oppression of the Poles, declared war on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and entered the right bank Ukraine with a huge 100,000-strong army. Unable to provide decent resistance, the royal government concluded the Bukak Peace with the Turks on October 18, 1672, according to which Western Podolia was directly part of the Ottoman Empire under the name Podolsk Eyalet, and the eastern one, the territory on which the right bank Cossack regiments were located, became the domain of Hetman Doroshenko, under the protectorate of the Porte. At the same time, the Russian Empire joined the struggle for right bank Ukraine. Considering, after the conclusion of the Polish-Turkish Bukak Peace, its obligations under the Andrusovo Truce de facto denounced, the Tsarist government in 1674, with the support of the left bank Cossacks of Ivan Samoilovich, elected Ukrainian hetman of left bank Ukraine in 1672, after the overthrow of Mnogoreshny, sent troops to the right bank of the Dnieper and besieged Chahairin, However, under the onslaught of Doroshenko and the Turks, it retreated. However, Doroshenko's authority among the right bank Cossacks was rapidly declining, mainly due to the outrages of his Turkish allies, as well as the hetman's inability to form an organized vertical of power. At the same time, the King of Poland, Jan III Sobieski, during the ongoing war, was able to return part of the territory torn off by the Ottoman Empire. Doroshenko's authority fell so low that at the Rada in Chigirin on October 13, 1675, he was forced to publicly swear an oath to the Tsar, and in January 1676, he sent hetmans Kleinodes, except for the mace, to Moscow. Nevertheless, Doroshenko continued to stall for time, and in March refused to surrender Chigirin to Tsarist Colonel V. Borkovsky. At the end of August 1676, the Turkish army crossed the Dniester and marched on Lviv. Immediately, an advance detachment was sent from the army of Romodanovsky and Samoilovich to Chigirin under the command of Colonel G. Kosogov and General Bunchuzhny L. Polubotka. 15,000 people, including 4 Cossack regiments and the hetman's outpost company. Encountering no resistance, they approached Chigirin, easily defeated Doroshenko's forces on the outskirts of the city, and prepared for a siege. The next day, Chigirin capitulated, having received confirmation from Samoilovich of the rights and liberties of the military. Doroshenko left for the left bank Ukraine, having sworn allegiance to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich and Hetman Ivan Samoilovich. The Ottoman Empire, however, did not recognize the actual transfer of a significant part of right bank Ukraine under Russian control. Therefore, in 1677, it sent troops there, in whose train Yuri Khmelnytsky, a Turkish protege for the hetman's vacancy, rode. The Ottomans' first attempt to take Chigirin ended unsuccessfully, but the campaign, which was equipped for the following year, turned out to be more successful. The Russian troops were forced to leave Chigirin and retreat to the left bank. At the same time, during the retreat, by order of Hetman Samoilovich, a huge number of people were driven from the right bank to the left, which was called the Great Roundup in history. By the end of the 1670s, right bank Ukraine was an almost complete ruin, ravaged by many years of wars, famine, epidemics, and destruction. The excesses of the Turks, the constant trips of the Tatars for Yasyr, and the resettlement, both voluntary and violent, of local residents to quieter regions left practically no settled population on the right bank. In 1681, a peace treaty was concluded between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, according to which the eastern part of right bank Ukraine was to remain uninhabited, while the western part remained with Turkey. During the 1680s and 1690s, Cossack self-government bodies were gradually restored on the right bank. However, in 1699, the Sejm of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decided to abolish the Cossacks, after which the resistance of Hetman S. Samus and Colonel S. Paili caused the last Cossack uprising in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1702-1704. Integration into the Russian state. In 1662, the Little Russian Order was created to manage the new territories. Russian troops supported the rebellious Cossacks, which led to the Russo-Polish War, 1654-1667. The war ended with the Andrusovo Truce, 1667, under the terms of which the territories lying east of the Dnieper, left bank Ukraine and Sivershkina, were ceded to Russia, and those lying west, right bank Ukraine and Belarus, remained with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The terms of the armistice were later confirmed by the Peace Treaty of 1686. Kiev was gaining a foothold behind Russia. The Pereyaslav Rada did not bring peace to the territory of the Hetmanate. After the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Ivan Vygovsky became hetman, but his power was disputed by the Zaporozhian Sich. The Cossack elite vacillated between Russia and Poland, which resulted in the Battle of Konotop. The time from the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky to the conclusion of the Eternal Peace in 1686 was called ruins in Ukrainian historiography. During the Polish-Turkish War of 1672 back in 1676, Podolia came under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and Kamenets-Podolsky became the center of the northernmost of its provinces. In July 1678, the Turkish army led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa invaded the borders of the Dnieper Ukraine, which was under Russian control, and besieged Chaihyrin. After a month-long siege, the city fell. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth could not help Russia in the fight against the Turks on this front, as it was greatly weakened by the war with the Ottoman Empire. In 1681, an armistice was signed in Bakhchisarai, and in early 1682, a peace treaty was concluded between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The agreement, concluded for 20 years, established the border between Russia and Turkey along the Dnieper River. Kiev and its surroundings remained in the possession of Russia. The territory between the Dnieper and the southern Bug was to remain uninhabited, and Zaporizhia was recognized as a sphere of Turkish influence. Turkish rule lasted until 1699, the Peace of Karlovika. In 1685, the government of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth carried out a reform restoring Cossack regiments on the territory of right bank Ukraine. However, in 1699, the Sejm of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decided to abolish the Cossacks, after which the resistance of Hetman S. Samus and Colonel S. Pali caused the last Cossack uprising in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1702–1704. Mazepa. In 1687, Ivan Mazepa became the hetman of the left bank Ukraine, Little Russian land. Sloboda Ukraine was under the rule of the Belgorod governor. Ivan Mazepa initially acted as a vassal of the Russian Tsar, but during the Northern War of 1700–1721, he decided to take advantage of the situation to get out of Russia's control. In this decision, he was supported by a part of the Cossack elders. To do this, he contacted the Poles, King Stanislaw Leszczynski, a Swedish protege, and then the Swedish king Charles III. Before the Battle of Poltava, part of the Cossacks under the command of Mazepa, about 3,000 men, went over to the side of the Swedes. However, the Swedes were defeated, and Ivan Mazepa and his loyal Cossacks fled to Turkey. Peter I, amazed by Mazepa's act, ordered the destruction of the hetman's capital and the Zaporozhian Sich, and the destruction of their population, and Mazepa himself was anathematized. In 1720, Peter the Great issued a decree stating, "His Imperial Majesty is aware that in the Kiev and Chernigov printing houses books are printed in disagreement with the great Russian ones, but with much opposition to the Eastern Church. Again, no books other than church baptismal editions should be printed. And the old church books, for perfect agreement with the great Russian ones, with the same church books, should first be printed with those great Russian ones, so that there would be no different and special dialect in them." Special dialects refers to local differences from the Moscow canons of the Church Slavonic language, which published church books. Little Russia Count Kirill Grigorievich Razumovsky was the last hetman of all Little Russia, both sides of the Dnieper, and the troops of the Zaporozhian in the Russian Empire. In 1764, Catherine II abolished the hetmanate and established the Little Russian province on its territory, from which the Kiev, Chernigov, and Novgorod-Seversk governorates were separated in 1781. In a secret instruction, the Prosecutor General of the Senate, Prince Vyazemsky, gave the following instructions. Little Russia, Livonia, Finland are provinces that are governed by the privileges they have confirmed, and it would be very obscene to violate them by abdicating all of them. These provinces, as well as Smolensk, must be brought by the easiest means to Russify them and stop looking like wolves in the forest. Until the Russian-Turkish War of 1768–1774, the lands in the lower reaches of the Dnieper, the Azov Sea and the Crimea remained under the control of the Crimean Khanate. These territories were ceded to the Russian Empire by the Kuchuk-Kainarji Peace Treaty, 1774, after which they began to be settled by Eastern Slavs, as well as Serbs resettled from the Balkans, Greeks, Germans, and Jews, to whom the government of the Russian Empire granted the right to settle in these places. After the victory over the Ottoman Empire, the Zaporozhian Sich was destroyed in 1775. At the end of May, troops consisting of 8 cavalry, 10 infantry regiments, 20 hussars, and 13 squadrons of Don Cossacks, totaling 100,000 people, moved from the fortress of St. Elizabeth to the Sich under the command of Lieutenant General Peter Tekeli and Major General Fyodor Arsenyevich Chorba. The Sich, in turn, was defended by 3,000 Cossacks. The Zaporozhians, caught off guard, were eager for battle, but the Sich elite, led by Peter Kalnyshevsky, convinced the Cossacks to lay down their arms. Already on June 15th, the Sich was completely destroyed, and on August 3rd, 1775, Catherine the Great declared in her manifesto, "Now there is no more Zaporozhian Sich in its political ugliness." One part of the Cossacks fled across the Danube, where they created the Trans-Danube Sich, and the other was resettled in the Kuban, where they created the Kuban Army. Most of the archival documents and weapons confiscated from the Zaporozhians were kept for a long time in the fortress of St. Błanisław, Pszczyna, and Nowy Wieniawski. Elizabeth, which in 1784 received the status of the city of Elisabethgrad, until they were evacuated to Moscow during the Civil War, 51. And Kalnyshevsky, who was the last Zaporozhian chieftain, died in prison on Solovki. Novorossiysk province was established on the former lands of the Zaporozhians, where new cities were founded on the sites of Cossack and Tatar settlements. Yekaterinoslav, Nikolaev, Kherson, Odessa, Novorossiysk, Sevastopol, Alexandrovsk, Mariupol, and others. New provinces were formed: Kiev, Kharkov, Yekaterinoslav, Taurida, Simferopol, Novorossiysk, Kherson. Until the end of the 16th, beginning of the 9th century, Ukraine was mainly an agrarian region due to the enslavement of the population. Gaidamaki Right Bank Ukraine, which remained part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was devastated during the era of the Ruins and the Palia Uprising, but from the first quarter of the 18th century, descendants of the former Ukrainian gentry began to return there, restore their rights to estates, and establish serfdom with the extensive development of lease relations. Peasants from Left Bank Ukraine, Hetmanate, were lured to the right bank by the promise of all kinds of benefits for a certain period of time. But then these immigrants returned to the usual serfdom, duties and penalties increased. This caused the peasantry to hate the gentry, who moreover had become largely sectarian and converted to Catholicism, as well as the Jewish tenants of the estates, who were intermediaries between their owners and the peasantry. There were groups of Gaidamaks who attacked nobles, merchants and Jews, and large groups of Gaidamaks attacked cities, trading towns, castles, killing nobles, Jews and Catholic clergy. The Gaidamaks were joined by urban burghers dissatisfied with the Jewish competition, newcomer Zaporozhian Cossacks, wandering Moldovans and Kalmyks. The Gaidamak movement in 1734, 1750, and 1768 took on the character of real uprisings that covered a significant territory. The 1768 uprising, known as the Kolivshchina, was suppressed with the help of Russian troops, sections of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As a result of the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between Russia, Austria, and Prussia in 1772-1795, Galicia joined the possessions of the Austrian Habsburgs, and the right bank Ukraine became the possession of Russia. In 1772, Lviv became the capital of the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria of the Austrian Empire. Right bank Ukraine, Volhynia, and Podylia were ceded to the Russian Empire. The national movement. Since the end of the 18th century, the Ukrainian national movement has been emerging, first culturally, and since the 1840s, Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, and politically. The formation of the modern Ukrainian nation has begun. Taras Shevchenko's work was important for the national awakening. As a result of the repression of the Tsarist government, the center of the national movement moved to Galicia in the 1870s. Since the end of the 19th century, Ukrainian political parties have been appearing, some of which demand an independent Ukrainian state. In the 1830s, a wave of the Slavophile movement came to Galicia, which found support among Galician Russians, primarily young people. Russians Markian Shashkevich, Yakov Golovatsky, and Ivan Vagilevich, nicknamed the Russian Trinity, for the first time published the Galician Russian literary almanac Rusalka Dnister in the local dialect. In this almanac, the idea of a single Slavic people sounded, which includes the Russian people, stretching east to the Don. Although the northern border of the settlement of the Russian people was not indicated, according to the general meaning of the almanac, the Russian people were understood as Little Russian Ukrainian. At the same time, it was noted that the Great Russians were also sister cities to the Galicians, and Novgorod was mentioned along with Kiev in the lines about ancient Russia. The conflict between Poles and Ukrainians Rusins in Galicia subsided or flared up depending on the internal policy of the Austrian government on the national issue. By supporting one side or the other, the Austrian government created a kind of balance in Galicia, which eventually made it possible to govern this region. Ukrainians were given the opportunity to start learning in their native language in primary schools and to introduce its teaching in gymnasiums. In the Russian Empire, the secret circular of the Minister of Internal Affairs Valuev in 1863, and then the decree of Alexander II of Ems in 1876, introduced serious restrictions on the use of the Ukrainian language in the press. From that moment on, the publication of Ukrainian literature began to move from Russia to Austria-Hungary, which turned into a kind of refuge for Ukrainian writers. Monsieur Dragomanov, the largest Ukrainian public figure of that time, also moved to Lviv for a while. By the end of the 19th century, Galicia began to be called the Ukrainian Piedmont, likening its role to that played by the Kingdom of Sardinia in the unification of Italy. M.S. Hrushevsky, who moved from Kiev to Lviv in 1894, argued that Galicia was the advanced part of the Ukrainian people, which has long overtaken the poor Russian Ukraine, that, until now, Galicia has been marching, and Ukraine has stood or followed Galicia. The 1897 census covered most of the territory of Ukraine, which was then part of the Russian Empire, and was the first to include the issue of native language. It revealed the predominance of the Ukrainian language in most of the territory of sub-Russian Ukraine, as well as in a number of administrative units in Kuban and Eastern Slobozhanshchina, the territories of which are now part of Russia, in Brest and Kobrin counties, the territories of which are now part of Belarus, as well as in Belsky district of Grodno province, Belsky and Lodowski counties of Siedlecki province, Hrubieszowski and Tomaszewski counties of Lublin province, whose territories are now part of Poland. At the same time, Odessa Uyezd, among the rural population of which, however, Ukrainian speakers were a relative majority, amounting to 46. 65. Crimea and Budzak, in 3 cities of which, Izmail, Kilia, and Belgorod-Dniester, as well as in Ackerman Uyezd, which occupied most of Budzak, Ukrainian speakers were not predominantly Ukrainian-speaking the largest language group. The most Ukrainian-speaking province in the Russian Empire was Poltava province, 93 of the population of which indicated Ukrainian as their native language. At the end of the 19th century, the Austrian authorities launched a campaign to persecute Muscovites. A series of lawsuits was initiated against them, which began with the so-called Olga Grabar trial, in which the defendants included Adolf Dobryansky, his daughter Olga, Ivan Naumovich, Venedikt Ploszczanski, Osip Markov, and others. In 1909, the fear of the penetration of ideas of Ukrainian separatism from Galicia into Russia forced the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of Finance to decide on the regular allocation of funds for assistance to the Carpathian Russians. In 1911, P.A. Stolypin released a lump sum of 15,000 rubles for the expenses of the elections to the Austrian Parliament. It was about helping organizations with a Muscovite orientation. Every year, at the request of the Minister of Internal Affairs, 60,000 rubles and 25,000 rubles were allocated directly through the Minister of Finance. The distribution and transfer of state sums for the maintenance and development of Russian cultural and educational institutions of the Carpathian Slavs were entirely under the jurisdiction of V.A. Bobrinsky and Chamberlain Gazitsky. The government entrusted them with the specified amounts without controlling them or demanding an account of the money spent. This was done primarily in order to avoid possible complications at the diplomatic level. Russian Orthodox Church. In May 1910, the Austrian authorities closed all Russophile organizations in Bukovina, Society of Russian Women, Carpathian, Russian Orthodox People's House, Russian Orthodox Orphanage, Russian Orthodox Reading Room, Russian Squad, as well as Russian Bursa, dormitories for young people, students in Chernivtsi and Sarita. The property of the organizations was confiscated. The reason for the ban on the activities of Russian organizations were unsubstantiated accusations of espionage and high treason. During the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian authorities in Galicia and Subcarpathia subjected the local Ruthenian population, who sympathized with Russia, to repression. Over 20,000 Ukrainians, Russophiles, were imprisoned in the Austrian concentration camp in the town of Talerhof, Styria, and in the fortress of Terezin, Czech Republic. During the First World War, active military operations took place in Galicia. A legion of Ukrainian sick riflemen was formed in Galicia, which fought on the side of the Austrian army. By the autumn of 1914, during the Battle of Galicia, Russian troops had occupied almost the entire eastern part of Galicia, and the Galician general government, centered in Lviv, was formed, which ruled the region until the summer of 1915, when the region was abandoned as a result of the German offensive. In 1916, the eastern part of Galicia was affected by the Brusilov breakthrough, the February Revolution, and the creation of the Central Rada. In the territory of present-day Ukraine, in 1917 to 1920, there were 16 self-proclaimed state formations. After the February Revolution, on March 4, 1917, the Central Rada of the UPR was established in Kiev on the initiative of the Association of Ukrainian Progressives with the participation of political parties, cooperatives, public and cultural organizations, the Ukrainian Scientific Society, the Ukrainian Pedagogical Society, the Association of Ukrainian Technicians and Agronomists, among others. Professor M. Grushevsky, who was temporarily replaced by V. Naumenko, was elected its head in absentia. A significant part of the Rada's members were social revolutionaries and Mensheviks. On March 22, 1917, the Rada issued its first appeal to the Ukrainian people. And on March 27, 1917, the leadership re-elected Mikhail Hrushevsky. The Central Rada has begun negotiations with the interim government of Russia on the conditions for Ukraine's entry into the Democratic Russian Republic on the rights of autonomy. On June 10th, the Central Rada issued the I Universal, which proclaimed the autonomy of Ukraine within Russia. On June 15th, the General Secretariat was formed, which played the role of the executive branch of the Ukrainian autonomy. It was headed by writer and leader of the Ukrainian Social Democrats, Fai K. Vinichenko. On July 3rd, in coordination with the Provisional Government, the Second Universal Central Rada was issued, which defined in detail the status of Ukraine as an autonomy within Russia. Negotiations between the Central Rada and the Provisional Government were interrupted by the October Revolution in Petrograd, as a result of which the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. The proclamation of the UPR after the news of the October Revolution in Petrograd, fighting broke out in Kiev between pro-Bolshevik forces, organized by the Kiev Soviet. The latter was headed by Bolshevik Georgy Pyatakov, who was in Petrograd at the time, however. His brother, also a Bolshevik Leonid, led the Kiev Revolutionary Committee, based on workers from the Arsenal factory and several military units, and the forces of the Kiev military, the districts that supported the already overthrown provisional government, represented by the Junkers and the Don Cossacks. The Central Rada, with its Ukrainian national regiments, initially maintained neutrality, but on November 30th, the Gaidamaks supported the Bolsheviks, which made the status quo hopeless. The latter surrendered, having given themselves the right to freely leave for the Don with weapons. However, L. Pyattakov's attempt to subordinate military units to the council provoked the resistance of the Rada and failed. On November 7th, 20th, 1917, the Central Rada, with its Third Universal, proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic consisting of 9 provinces: Kiev, Podolsk, Volyn, Chernigov, Poltava, Kharkov, Yekaterinoslav, Kherson, and Taurida, northern counties without Crimea. This republic, however, was still supposed to be an autonomy within the Federative Russian Republic. Universal also proclaimed the socialization of the land, an 8-hour working day, and other social guarantees. The Rada formally recognized the Council of People's Commissars as the government of Russia, and was forced to coexist with the Ukrainian Soviets. The All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets was scheduled for December 4th. The Congress was being prepared by the Bolshevik Organizing Committee, which hoped to create its majority there, and on the eve, November 30th, relying on the Bolshevik units in Kiev to carry out a coup on the Petrograd model, overthrow the Rada and transfer power to the Congress. However, the Rada was ahead of the Bolsheviks. Relying on the Ukrainian national units, it arrested L on November 29th. Pyatakov, however, was released the next day and began to disarm the pro-Bolshevik units. The Bolsheviks still hoped to peacefully seize power from the Rada at the first All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets, which opened on December 4th in Kiev. At the opening of the Congress, the Petrograd Council of People's Commissars sent an ultimatum to the Central Rada demanding recognition of Soviet power, as well as to disarm Cossack and officer units heading for the Don and join the fight against them. The Rada promptly brought 2,000 representatives of peasant unions and Ukrainian units to Kiev, as a result of which the Bolshevik deputies found themselves in an overwhelming minority, with 100 delegates out of 2,000, mostly from the councils of the Donetsk-Krivoy Rog Basin. The Congress supported the Central Rada, while the Bolshevik minority moved to Kharkov, occupied by the Russian Red Guards, and held its Congress there on December 11th to 12th, at which it proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets, cancelled all orders of the Central Rada, elected its own government, the People's Secretariat headed by Evgenia Bosch, and called for the help of the Russian proletariat. To spread its influence to the southern provinces and the Don, which was under the control of Ataman Kaledin, the Bolshevik government created the Southern Revolutionary Front under the command of A.I. Antonov Ovsenko and the left socialist revolutionary M.A. Muravyev, chief of staff. On December 9th, Antonov Ovsenko's 30,000-strong army occupied Kharkov, where the Soviet Congress was soon held. As a result of the fighting that followed between the troops of the Central Rada and the Soviets, the troops of the Central Rada were defeated, and the Bolsheviks took power in Yekaterinoslav, Poltava, Kremenchuk, Elisavetgrad, Nikolaev, Kherson, and other cities. The response from the Rada in Kiev was the abduction and secret murder of L. Pyatakov. On January 9th, 22nd, 1918, the Central Rada, with its Fourth Universal, announced the secession from Russia and the state independence of Ukraine. Muravyov's detachments were already on the distant approaches to Kiev at that moment. On January 16th, 29th, 1918, a battle took place near Kruty, 130 kilometers northeast of Kiev, in which the superior forces of the Red Guards defeated a Ukrainian detachment, mainly of students, Junkers, students, high school students. In the Ukrainian tradition, this battle is revered as a heroic episode of the struggle for independence and the baptism of fire of the Ukrainian army. On January 16th, 29th, 1918, a Bolshevik uprising began in Kiev against the Central Rada, in which workers of the Arsenal factory and part of the Bolshevik Ukrainian regiments participated. The reason for the uprising was the discovery of the body of L. Pyatakov, who had been abducted 3 weeks earlier, with signs of torture. Judging by the wounds, his heart had been cut out with checkers while still alive. By February 4th, the uprising was suppressed, but on February 8th, Kiev was occupied by Muravyov's troops. The entry of the Reds into Kiev was marked by the brutal murder of Metropolitan Vladimir Bogoyavlensky of Kiev and Galicia. This was followed by mass shootings of the bourgeoisie, intellectuals, and especially officers, who were given a red registration card issued to them by the Rada as an identity document. Up to 5,000 people were shot in just 3 weeks. Then Muravyov took a large contribution from the city and moved on to Odessa. In February, Soviet power was established throughout Ukraine. At the same time, the workers' councils of the industrial and Russified east of Ukraine did not want to obey Kiev, and on February 12th proclaimed the Donetsk-Krivoy Rog Soviet Republic. The republic was proclaimed in Kharkov, which became its capital. The German occupation and the Hetmanate. The Central Rada has sent its delegation to Brest-Litovsk for negotiations. There, without waiting for the end of the general negotiations, on February 9th, 1918, the UPR delegation signed a separate treaty with Germany and requested to send its troops to defend against the Bolshevik forces. On February 18th, 1918, the Germans declared an end to the armistice and launched a general offensive, encountering almost no resistance. On March 1st, German troops entered Kiev. The power of the Central Rada was restored. In the Donetsk-Krivoy Rog region, local Red Guard detachments tried to resist the Germans, but unsuccessfully. On April 8th, the Germans occupied Kharkov. The government of the Donetsk Kryvyi Rog Republic fled to Lugansk. By the end of April, Donbass was completely occupied. The Germans occupied the maximum territory of the former southern provinces of the Russian Empire, disregarding the letter of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and referring to the fact that this was not the territory of the RSFSR, but of the German allied Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine was turned into a German protectorate, which the Germans viewed primarily from the angle of supplying the blockaded and starving fatherland with raw materials and especially food. The weak power of the Central Rada could not effectively contribute to achieving these goals, and the German military administration, headed by Field Marshal Hermann von Eichhorn, commander of Army Group Kiev, decided to establish a harsh dictatorship. The last straw that prompted the Germans to take action against the Rada was the abduction by government agents, with the personal participation of the Minister of War of the Director of the Russian Bank for Foreign Trade, A.Y. Dobrogo. The Ukrainian ministers considered him the mastermind of the anti-socialist measures of the German command. After that, the Central Rada was dispersed by German soldiers, and the ministers involved in Dobry's abduction were arrested and put on trial. See Central Rada dispersal. On April 29, 1918, the socialists of the Central Rada were replaced by P.P. Skoropadsky, a former lieutenant general of the Tsarist army, a large landowner and an aristocrat, a descendant of Hetman Ivan Skoropadsky. At the Congress of Grain Growers, actually wealthy and large landowners, Skoropadsky was proclaimed Hetman of Ukraine. A new name of the country was adopted, the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian power. Relying on German bayonets, on the one hand, on the landlords and the imperial bureaucracy and officers, on the other, Skoropadsky set a course for a pronounced socio-political reaction. All the socialist laws of the Central Rada were repealed, the social gains of the workers were eliminated, and the working day was raised to 12 hours. Landed proprietorship was restored in the village, and mass food requisitions were carried out. This caused widespread hatred of the Skoropadsky regime. An insurrectionary movement began in the village against the Hetman government and the Germans. Among the partisan commanders in the east of Ukraine, N.I. Makhno, who operated in Yekaterinoslav province, was particularly prominent. However, in the summer of 1918, he was only one of many minor partisan chieftains. Another major guerrilla commander was Ataman Grigoriev. Attacks on individual German detachments and garrisons provoked retaliatory punitive measures by the Germans: floggings, shootings, burning of villages, which in turn further embittered the peasantry. On July 30th, Eichhorn was killed in Kiev by the Russian leftist socialist revolutionary B.M. Donskoy. Restoration of the UNR. The defeat of Germany in World War I and the German Revolution on November 9, 1918, dramatically complicated the situation of the Skoropadsky regime. The Germans lost interest in Ukrainian affairs and began evacuating, while the Entente forces were in no hurry to take their place. In search of support, Skoropadsky moved between Ukrainian nationalists and Russian White Guards, and eventually opted for the latter, declaring Ukraine an integral part of the future non-Bolshevik Russian Federation in his manifesto of November 14th. On the same day, and even without any connection with the manifesto, the leaders of the dissolved Central Rada, at a secret meeting in Kiev, decided to revolt against the Hetman and restore the UPR, electing a 5-member directorate headed by Vladimir Vinichenko, who already headed the UPR government. The commander-in-chief, Chief Ataman of the Army and Navy, was former UNR Minister of War Simon Petliura has been appointed. On November 16th, a group of Sich riflemen, led by Evgeny Konovalets, rose up in Belaya Tserkva in support of the Directory. On the left bank, the uprising was supported by the Zaporozhian Corps under the command of Pyotr Bolbochan. Petliura's manifesto on the uprising aroused mass enthusiasm among the peasant population, who rose up to fight against the Germans, landowners, and Hetman officers. Having defeated the Hetman detachments near Motovilovka, Petliura besieged Kiev on November 20th. The Hetman's Serdyuks were unreliable and easily sided with Petliura. The Hetman's last support remained the Russian units, hastily formed mainly from officers. The Germans, who initially supported the Hetman, eventually declared their neutrality, and on December 14th, the hetman abdicated and fled to Germany. The Petliurists who broke into the city massacred the officers. On December 19th, the Directory solemnly entered Kiev 7 However, within the Directory itself, the conflict between the socialists and the military, led by Petliura, was growing. At the beginning of 1919, Vinichenko and other socialists were removed from the Directory, and it was actually headed by Petliura, who established his military dictatorship. Under Petliura, numerous Jewish pogroms took place in Ukraine. On January 22, 1919, the Directory signed the Act of Union with the government of Western Ukraine, in Ukrainian, the Act of Separation. This day is celebrated nowadays as the Day of the Unity of Ukraine, the civil war on the territory of Ukraine. With the evacuation of the German-Austrian troops at the end of 1918, a political vacuum was created on the territory of Ukraine, which three forces claimed to fill: Petliura, the Bolsheviks, and Denikin. Most of the territory previously controlled by the Germans and Skoropadsky came under Petliura's control in December 1918. However, at the same time, Bolshevik forces, the Ukrainian Soviet Army, under the command of V.A. Antonov Ovsenko, joined forces with Makhno, in particular, from the territory of the RSFSR. On January 3, 1919, the Bolsheviks captured Kharkov, where the central organs of Soviet power in Ukraine settled, and on February 5th, Kiev was captured by the Bolsheviks. The Petliura government fled to Vinnytsia, and then to Kamenets-Podilsky. On March 10th, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the independent Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, originally the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, with its capital in Kharkov, located in a military alliance with the RSFSR. At the same time, not only the southern provinces, Novorossiya, but also the western part of the former Donskoy Army region, liquidated by the Bolsheviks, were included in the Ukrainian SSR. The Taurida province was ceded to the RSFSR. In the spring of 1919, the offensive of the armed forces of the Russian Federation began, which occupied Donbass, Yekaterinoslav, Kharkov, and Odessa. On August 31st, Kiev was taken by the Whites, together with the Petliurists, who, however, were immediately driven out of the city by the Whites. Relying on Ukraine, the Whites launched an offensive against Moscow in the fall. However, Denikin's troops were forced to fight on three fronts. In the west of Ukraine, they fought Petliura's army, while Makhno's rebel army successfully operated in their rear. The latter took control of vast areas of the Azov region and Yekaterinoslav province, establishing in them a kind of authority of peasant councils. In October 1919, the White offensive lost its strength, and the Red Army launched a counter-offensive. On December 12th, she retook Kharkov, and on December 16th, Kiev. By the end of the year, the Donbass was occupied by the Reds, and the power of the Ukrainian SSR was re-established in most of the territory of Ukraine. The Whites still held the front in the south, Uman-Elisavetgrad, but in January 1920, they were finally defeated, and Odessa was taken on February 8th. Western Ukraine. As a result of the collapse of Austria-Hungary in 1918, the West Ukrainian People's Republic, WUNR, was established on the territory of Galicia. The republic was proclaimed on the night of November 1st by the Sich Riflemen, Ukrainian national units in the Austro-Hungarian army. However, Galicia, especially in the cities, had a significant Polish population, and Poles in Poland itself firmly considered Galicia to be Polish land. As a result, an armed uprising of Poles began in Lviv on the same day, see Lviv Eaglets. These events served as a signal for the beginning of the Polish-Ukrainian War. On January 22, 1919, the ZUNR proclaimed the Act of Unification with the UNR, the Act of Evil. By the beginning of June 1919, almost the entire ZUNR was occupied by Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. The UGA controlled only the right bank of the Zbruch River, the eastern border between the ZUNR and the UPR. On June 7, 1919, the UGA launched the Chortkov Offensive, as a result of which the ZUNR troops advanced close to Lviv and Stanislav by June 24th and occupied Ternopil. However, on June 28th, the Polish offensive began, and by July 16th, the UGA was pushed back to its positions on June 7th. A hasty evacuation of the UGA to the left bank of the Zbruch began, and thus on July 18th, 1919, the UGA completely lost control of the territory of the Zunar. Some of the defeated troops fled to Czechoslovakia, where they became known as the Ukrainian Brigade. But the bulk of the army, numbering about 50,000 soldiers, moved to the territory of the Ukrainian People's Republic. On April 21, 1920, Poland and the UPR entered into an alliance against the RSFSR, agreeing that the border should run along the Zbruch River. In fact, however, Petlura was no longer an independent force at that moment, and could only exist with Polish support. With the disappearance of the latter 2 months later, with the defeat of the Poles by Soviet troops in Ukraine, the UNR has finally ceased to exist. The Soviet-Polish War. On April 25, 1920, Polish and Ukrainian troops attacked Red Army positions along the entire length of the front, and by April 28th, they had occupied the Chernobyl-Kazatan-Vinnytsia-Romanian borderline. On May 7th, they occupied Kiev. But already in May 1920, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive. On June 12th, they captured Kiev, and in July they began operations in western Ukraine. For a short time, the Bessarabian Soviet Socialist Republic, May-September 1919, and the Galician Soviet Socialist Republic, July-September 1920, formally proclaimed as part of the RSFSR, were under actual Soviet rule. However, none of the parties achieved their goals during the war. Belarus and Ukraine were divided between Poland and the republics that joined the Soviet Union in 1922. According to the Riga Treaty of 1921, Western Ukraine became part of Poland. Bukovina was ceded to Romania, Transcarpathia to Czechoslovakia. The Ukrainian SSR. According to the 1920 census, the population of Soviet Ukraine was 5 million people. Of these, 9 million rural residents and 6 million urban residents. On December 30th, 1922, by signing the Union Treaty, the Ukrainian SSR, together with the RSFSR, the Byelorussian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SFSR, became part of the USSR. In 1923, Stanitsa Luganskaya and the adjacent territories of the Don region of the RSFSR were transferred to the Ukrainian SSR. In August 1924, the Taganrog and Shakhty districts were transferred to the RSFSR. On October 16, 1925, the Ukrainian SSR was transferred from Kursk province. The territory of the former Putyvilsky district, without Krupetsky Volost, Krenichansky Volost of Grey-Voronsky district, and 2 incomplete Volosts of Grey-Voronsky and Belgorod districts. On April 1, 1926, the Semenovskaya Volost of the Novozybkovsky district of the Gomel province of the RSFSR was transferred to the Ukrainian SSR. Also in 1926, the Troitskaya Volost of the Valusky district of the Voronezh province was transferred to the Kupiansky district of the Ukrainian SSR. In the first years after the Civil War, the policy of Ukrainization, led to an increase in the number of Ukrainian schools and universities. The Soviet government pursued a policy under the slogan, National in Form, Soviet in Content. According to the population census conducted in 1926, Ukrainians made up 80. 1 of the population, 87. 5 rural and 47. 3 urban, Russians, 9. 2, 5. 6 rural and 25. 1 urban, Jews, 5. 4, 1. 5 rural and 22. 7 urban, 76. 4 of the inhabitants of the Ukrainian SSR within its borders at that time, including 85. 6 of the rural and 36. 0 of the urban population, called Ukrainian their native language. Russian was spoken as a native language by 15. 3, 8. 6 of rural and 44. And 6 of urban population. 81. 5 of the population lived in rural areas. 18. 5 in urban areas. In the late 1920s, the leadership of the CPSUB changed its overall political course, and the Communist Party of Ukraine was purged for its nationalist bias. As a result of the terror of the 1930s, many Ukrainian writers and representatives of the creative intelligentsia were killed. Western Ukraine. At that time, a policy of Polonization was being implemented in Western Ukraine, which became part of Poland, and national oppression was intensifying. The response was the rise of the nationalist movement, which immediately took violent forms. When Józef Pilsudski came to power in Poland, as a result of the coup d'etat of 1926, an authoritarian regime known as rehabilitation was established here. The political opposition was persecuted by legal means and forceful methods. A policy of cultural suppression was pursued towards national minorities, which in the autumn of 1930, after numerous provocations and terrorist attacks by Ukrainian nationalist organizations against the Polish population, escalated into mass repression against the Ukrainian population of Galicia and Volhynia. Pacification. Units of the Polish police and army were deployed in more than 800 villages. More than 2,000 people were arrested. Ukrainian organizations were liquidated, and about 500 houses were burned down. Ukrainian pogroms by Polish chauvinist groups became an integral part of the pacification. It came to the point that in 1932, the League of Nations condemned the actions of the Polish government towards the Ukrainian population. According to the 1931 census, 9 million people lived in western Ukraine, including 6 million Ukrainians, and 2 million Poles. In 1939, the Carpathian Ukraine within Czechoslovakia was captured by Hungary as a result of the Munich Agreement and the partition of Czechoslovakia. As a result of the secret additional protocol on the delimitation of spheres of interest to the non-aggression treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union, and the subsequent Polish campaign of the Red Army, Western Ukraine was annexed to the Ukrainian SSR in 1939, and northern Bukovina and the southern part of Bessarabia in 1940. The Second World War. During the Great Patriotic War, the entire territory of Ukraine fell under German occupation. At the beginning of the war, one of the branches of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists attempted to create a Ukrainian state, but the occupation authorities of Nazi Germany reacted extremely negatively to this idea. As a result, some nationalists, in particular Stepan Bandera, were imprisoned in concentration camps, while others continued to cooperate with the Nazis. During the war, the partisan movement was widely developed on the territory of Ukraine. The guerrilla groups fighting against the Axis powers were formed on the initiative of Soviet activists. The Soviet Union of Eskovpak became the most famous. Since 1943, the nationalist UPA had been operating, which declared a struggle against the German and Soviet sides, as well as engaged in ethnic cleansing. The German occupation of Ukraine was particularly brutal, especially towards Jews. More than 100,000 people were killed in Kiev alone. The most famous place of execution of civilians is Babi Yar. The territory of Ukraine was liberated in 1944. The wave of war swept from one end of Ukraine to the other twice, first from west to east, then from east to west. Over 5 million Ukrainians died in the war, and about 2 million were forced to work in Germany. About 700 cities and towns and 28,000 villages were destroyed on the territory of Ukraine. Over 10 million people were left homeless. The economy has been severely damaged. 1944-1990. When the United Nations was established on October 24, 1945, the Ukrainian SSR and the BSSR, along with the USSR, became members of the General Assembly. From that day until the collapse, the Soviet Union was represented in the adoption of UN resolutions by 3 independent voices. In 1945, Transcarpathia was annexed to the Ukrainian SSR, and in 1954, with the personal assistance of Nikita Khrushchev, Crimea was transferred from the RSFSR. After Nikita Khrushchev, the former first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, came to power in Moscow, the regime relaxed, and the generation of 60s grew up. After his removal, many Ukrainian 60s became dissidents who were persecuted by the authorities. See Letter 139. The accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, caused radioactive contamination of vast territories and increased distrust of the party leadership, who tried to hide the fact of the accident. As a result of the Russification of Ukraine during the Soviet era, the share of Ukrainian speakers in the population has significantly decreased, while the share of Russian speakers has increased. The proportion of people who consider Ukrainian their native language in the population decreased from 73 0 to 64, 7 between 1959 and 1989. The decrease in the proportion of those who consider Ukrainian their native language was especially noticeable in the south and east of the Ukrainian SSR 79, in the Luhansk region, by 15, 6 from 50, 5 to 34, 9 in the Donetsk region, by 13, 8 from 44, 4 to 30, 6 in the Zaporizhia region, by 11, 7 from 61, 0 to 49, 3 in the Kharkiv region, by 10, 7 from 61, 2 to 50, 5 in the Dnipropetrovsk region, by 10, 6 from 72, 1 to 61, 5 in the Mykolaiv region, by 9, 2 from 73, 4 to 64, 2 in the Kherson region, by 8, 0 from 75, 7 to 67, 7. During Perestroika, the national movement began to rise. On September 8, 10, 1989, the Congress of the People's Movement of Ukraine for Perestroika was held in the conference hall of the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, which became the main organizational and driving force in Ukraine's progress towards independence. On January 23, 1990, on the 71st anniversary of the unification of the Ukrainian and West Ukrainian People's Republics, millions of people joined hands and joined Ivano-Frankivsk, Lviv, Rivne, and Kiev. The length of the human chain exceeded 770 kilometers. People from all regions of Ukraine, including Kharkiv and Donetsk, participated in the Ukrainian Wave, another name for the action. On July 16, 1990, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine. 355 deputies voted in favor, 4 against. On October 17, 1990, students began a hunger strike on October Revolution Square, now Independence Square, demanding the democratization of all socio-political processes and the termination of the Union Agreement. On October 17th, the Verkhovna Rada adopted a resolution on reviewing the demands of students who have been on hunger strike in Kiev since October 2nd, 1990. Formally, the demands of the protesters were accepted. In 1990, the first democratic elections were held to the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR, which adopted a declaration of sovereignty. Ukraine in 1991, 2013. After the August 1991 coup, on August 24, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR proclaimed the independence of Ukraine and the formation of an independent Ukrainian state, Ukraine, which was subsequently confirmed by a nationwide referendum on December 1, 1991. A democratic political system has been formed. Ukraine played a big role in the collapse of the USSR. She was a key political player who advocated separation and also ensured the peaceful passage of the disintegration process. The overwhelming support for independence among the population ensured the failure of both Gorbachev's project of a reformed USSR and Yeltsin's more moderate plan for a Russian-controlled confederation. The tolerant attitude towards Russians in Ukraine allowed Yeltsin to ignore calls for their protection in the former Soviet periphery. Russians in Ukraine had no concerns about an independent Ukraine and supported it, ensuring the peaceful collapse of the USSR. The collapse of the USSR was unexpected and mostly bloodless. However, immediately after the collapse of the USSR, tensions arose between Ukraine and Russia over the degree of independence. Russia has not abandoned its role as a leading member of the CIS and has tried to turn education into a political, economic, and military alliance led by Russia. Ukraine was one of the founders of the CIS, but participated in it selectively. The friction between the two states formed after the collapse of the USSR continued throughout the 1990s, turning into a confrontation and into an open conflict of limited military confrontation in 2014, and into the largest war in Europe after World War II in 2022. In the mid-90s, Russia and Ukraine took different paths in their political development. Russia became more authoritarian every year, while Ukraine, despite the president's attempts to strengthen power and subjugate parliament, remained a democratic state. These factors had a significant impact on the relations between the two former parts of the USSR. The example of a functioning democracy with a strong parliament posed a great threat to the political regime in Russia. Russian opposition to rising authoritarianism was inspired by the example of neighboring Ukraine. Democratic traditions and the parliamentary system made it much more difficult for Russia to regain control of Ukraine. Western countries insisted that elective government was necessary for their good relations with post-Soviet states, which provided Ukraine with significant political ties with Europe and the United States. In the 1990s, Ukraine found itself in a deep economic crisis. In 1995, 62% of the population found themselves below the poverty line with an income of less than $21 per month. Inconsistent reforms since 1990 have led to a deep economic crisis that has complicated the political situation. By this point, there were a number of weaknesses in the Ukrainian economy. At the time of independence, Ukraine did not have its own monetary system or gold and foreign exchange reserves. All the republics of the USSR did not have the necessary experience in foreign markets and much more, which is the norm for any country with a market economy. Ukraine gained independence along with the crisis that affected all the republics of the former USSR, which covered all spheres of the economy, culture, science, and so on. This crisis has significantly complicated the solution of the most important tasks: building Ukraine's own statehood and putting the economy on a market track. The curtailment of the large-scale Soviet defense program, which in the 1980s involved most of the leading Ukrainian enterprises and research centers, led many of them to close. Most design institutes and design bureaus, including civilian ones, were closed. Some of those produced in the USSR, and, in particular, in Ukraine. The goods were uncompetitive in foreign markets. Decades-old business ties with the former Soviet republics of the USSR were severed, and hyperinflation reduced the enterprise's own working capital to zero. The problems of the Chernobyl zone still distracted large material resources. Most of the unique production facilities of Ukraine, as well as the USSR as a whole, were plundered during the spontaneous privatization of the 1990s and ceased to function source not specified for 680 days. A very important obstacle to the development of independent Ukraine was the fact that a significant part of the ruling elite of Ukraine in the 1990s, in government agencies, in the media, at major enterprises, did not seek to build Ukraine as a state source not specified 680 days. As a result of the managerial crisis at the top in 1992-1996, falling GDP and inflation in Ukraine significantly exceeded similar problems in Russia and Belarus. For example, in 1995, 62% of the population found themselves below the poverty line with an income of less than $21 per month, whereas in Russia, which had access to fossil resources to compensate for the economic downturn, less than 50% of the population found themselves below the poverty line. The Ukrainian-American historian of Eastern Europe, Serhiy Plokhy, notes the democratic character of Ukrainian society and the lack of expression of Ukrainian nationalism in the 1990s, the first years after independence, despite economic and other difficulties. Nationalism had little support in the regions. On December 1st, 1991, Leonid Kravchuk was elected president of Ukraine in the first direct presidential election, gaining 61.6% of the vote. On December 8th, 1991, Kravchuk signed the Belovezhskaya Agreement with President of the RSFSR Boris Yeltsin and Chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Byelorussian SSR-SS Shushkevich on the termination of the existence of the USSR and the creation of the CIS. On December 10th, the Verkhovna Rada ratified the agreement. However, the Ukrainian parliament did not ratify the Charter of the Commonwealth in 1993, and Ukraine has never been a member of the CIS, having only associate membership. On June 19, 1992, President Kravchuk signed a law on the complete exclusion of references to the USSR from the Constitution of Ukraine in 1978. At the ceremonial session of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on August 22, 1992 in Kiev, the last president of the UPR in exile, Nikolai Plavyuk, handed over the state regalia of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, to the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk. Plavyuk also presented a certificate stating that independent Ukraine, proclaimed on August 24, 1991, is the legal successor of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The privatization of the country's industry was accompanied by significant corruption. Inflation reached thousands of percent from 1992 to 1994. There have been long-term delays in the payment of salaries for industry workers, teachers, etc. In 1992, President Kravchuk actively supported Metropolitan Filaret, Denisenko, whom he had supervised for many years as a leading ideological worker of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, in his efforts to create the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate. In 1992, Ukraine became a member of the International Monetary Fund. In 1994, Ukraine joined the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and in 1996, nuclear warheads were removed from the territory of Ukraine. The transition from a command and administrative economy to market relations has caused an aggravation of the socio-economic situation in the country, which has led to an aggravation of the political situation. It was decided to hold early elections of the president and the Verkhovna Rada. On March 27, 1994, elections to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine were held. 338 people's deputies were elected, half of whom were members of political parties. Total seats received: KPU, 96, People's Movement of Ukraine, 20, CEL-PU, 18, and SPU, 14, which testified to the dominance of leftist forces. The socialist Alexander Moros was elected chairman of the Verkhovna Rada. The new parliament approved Vaimasol as prime minister. The process of changing political power in Ukraine was completed by the presidential elections held in June-July 1994. Leonid Kuchma won the second round of elections. The free elections of 1994 showed that Ukraine is on the democratic path of development. At the initial stage of Leonid Kuchma's presidency, market reforms were continued, but this could not stop the decline in production, which was aggravated by inflation of the carbovanets. On June 28, 1996, the Constitution of Ukraine was adopted, which consolidated the achievements of a sovereign state. The document was also supposed to regulate the powers of the legislative, executive, and judicial authorities. In September of the same year, the National Bank, headed by Viktor Yushchenko, introduced the national currency hryvnia. The stabilization of the financial sector was one of the prerequisites for the revival of the economy. In 1997, a major agreement was signed between Russia and Ukraine. In March 1998, parliamentary elections were held under a new system, a mixed proportional majority system. Of the 450 deputies, 225 were elected in single-mandate constituencies, and 225 were elected on lists from political parties and blocs in a multi-mandate nationwide constituency. According to the results of the vote, the Communist Party of Ukraine, 24-65, the People's Movement of Ukraine, yes in 9, in 4, 32, the electoral bloc of the SPU and the CEL-PU, for Truth, for the People, for Ukraine, 8, 6, the Green Party of Ukraine, 5, and 4, the People's Democratic Party, 5, 17, the All-Ukrainian Association, Hromada, almost 4, 7, 16, the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, 4. According to the Constitution, presidential elections were scheduled for October 31st, 1999. In the second round, incumbent President Leonid Kuchma defeated communist leader Pyotr Simonenko. 56 of voters voted for Kuchma, 38 for Simonenko. After the election of the president, there was a change of government. In December 1999, Viktor Yushchenko, then chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine, who had a reputation as a reformer, was appointed Prime Minister of Ukraine. During the years of his premiership, important shifts have taken place in the economic life of the country, and economic growth has begun. A parliamentary majority was formed in the Verkhovna Rada. In January 2000, it was formed by deputies from 11 parliamentary groups and factions, as well as certain non-factional deputies. The majority supported the actions of the Yushchenko government. Ivan Plyushch has become chairman of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. An all-Ukrainian referendum was held on April the 16th, 2000. More than 80 of the voters who took part in the voting called for the creation of a bicameral parliament, reducing the number of deputies from 450 to 300, eliminating the right of parliamentary immunity, and the right of the president to terminate the powers of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine prematurely if the latter fails to form a parliamentary majority within 1 month, or fails to approve a prepared and submitted in accordance with the procedure established by the Cabinet of Ministers, the draft state budget of Ukraine. However, the decisions of the referendum were never implemented. In the spring of 2001, Ukraine was gripped by a political crisis related to the murder of opposition journalist Georgy Gongadze. The recordings of Major of the Security Service of Ukraine, A. Melnichenko, made by him in the office of the president, testified to the involvement of representatives of the highest echelons of power in this and other high-profile crimes. They caused a high-profile cassette scandal, which significantly reduced the people's trust in the government. Mass demonstrations and protests were organized as part of the Ukraine Without Kuchmas campaign, which even ended in clashes with police on March 9, 2001. However, the opposition failed to achieve its goal, but the authority of the government was significantly undermined both inside the country and abroad. In 2001, the entire Yushchenko government was dismissed. This was the impetus for the formation of a powerful opposition. During the autumn and winter of 2001, electoral blocs were formed. The main rivals in the parliamentary elections were Viktor Yushchenko's opposition bloc, Our Ukraine, and the pro-government bloc for United Ukraine. The March 2002 elections were held under a mixed electoral system. According to the results of the vote, the 4% barrier was overcome by Viktor Yushchenko's Our Ukraine bloc, 2355, the Communist Party of Ukraine, 2001, the For United Ukraine bloc, 1179, Yulia Tymoshenko's bloc, 725, the Socialist Party of Ukraine, 687, the Social Democratic Party, the Party of Ukraine, United, 627. For the first time in the history of independent Ukraine, the Communist Party lost first place in the election race. The 2004 presidential elections in Ukraine were a turning point in the country's history. The then Prime Minister of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, became the candidate of power. The opposition forces have grouped around the leader of Our Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, a former Prime Minister, 19 Maintainant, 2001, a supporter of reforms. As a result of the voting on October 31, 2004, the votes were distributed as follows. Viktor Yushchenko, 39. 26 of the vote, Viktor Yanukovych, 39. 11, Alexander Moros, 5. 82, Peter Simonenko, 4. 97. This arrangement did not reveal a winner, so a second round of elections was scheduled for November 21, 2004. After the first round, Alexander Moroz and Anatoly Kinak expressed their support for Yushchenko. Natalia Vitrenko supported Yanukovych. The second round of voting was conducted with numerous violations and falsifications. The results published by the CEC on Yanukovych's victory differed sharply from the exit polls that indicated Yushchenko's victory. Outraged by this situation, voters responded to the call of the opposition candidate to defend their choice, and on the evening of November 21st, gathered for a rally in Kiev's central square, Independence Square. The next day, the rally turned into a massive peaceful protest, which lasted until December 8, 2004, and was called the Orange Revolution. By its decision of December 3, 2004, the Supreme Court of Ukraine invalidated the results of the second round of the presidential election and scheduled the second round for December 26, 2004. During the Orange Revolution, Ukraine was in the spotlight of the world press. A record number of international observers, about 12,000 people, came to Ukraine for the re-voting. The re-voting on December 26, 2004 yielded the following results. 51. 99 of voters voted for Viktor Yushchenko. 44. 21 for Viktor Yanukovych. The inauguration of the new president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, took place on January 23, 2005. In 2004, Ukrainian voters rebelled against a rigged presidential election when the victory of the Russian-backed Viktor Yanukovych was declared. The conflict between Russian authoritarianism and Ukrainian democracy turned into an international crisis during the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Western countries unequivocally supported the Ukrainian expression of will. Following the results of the revolution, and as a result of the re-voting, Viktor Yushchenko was declared the winner. The Ukrainian Revolution of 2004 caused further disagreements between Ukraine and Russia, and consequently between Russia and the West, which ended in a war. On January 17, 2010, the first round of the presidential elections in Ukraine took place, as a result of which the winner was not revealed. On February 7th, a second round of elections was held, in which opposition leader Viktor Yanukovych won, with an advantage of 3-48, 95 versus 45, 47, over the then Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko. This is the first time in Ukraine's history that an elected president has received less than 50 of the vote. On March 11th, a new government was formed, headed by Mykola Azarov. On April 21st, Viktor Yanukovych signed the Kharkiv Agreements with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev on extending the stay of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol until 2042. On April 27th, this treaty was simultaneously ratified by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and the State Duma of the Russian Federation. On November 16, 2010, protests against the tax code, Tax Maidan, began. Mass rallies and protests were held in many cities, and a tent city was set up on Independence Square in Kiev. About 20,000 protesters gathered on the main square of the capital. Russian was given the status of a regional language in the city of Sevastopol, Donetsk, Lugansk, with the exception of 4 northern regions, where less than 10 of the population named Russian as their mother tongue during the 2001 census. Odessa, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Kherson, and Dnipropetrovsk regions of Ukraine, which caused considerable resonance, sharp discussions in society, and provoked protest actions. Get busy with business, not language. Language Maidan, and revenge for the split of the country. There were also concerns that the law could lead Ukraine to a Belarusian language situation. On November 21st, 2013, a few days before the Vilnius summit, the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine decided to suspend the process of preparing the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. This caused mass protests in Ukraine. Euromaidan, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the war in eastern Ukraine. The decision of the government of Ukraine to suspend the process of preparing for the signing of the association agreement with the European Union in November 2013 caused massive months-long protests, called Euromaidan. On February 21st, Yanukovych signed an agreement with opposition leaders to resolve the political crisis. 7. But then, on February 22nd, President Viktor Yanukovych, who flew to Kharkiv, was declared self-deposed by the Verkhovna Rada 108. On February 23rd, the Verkhovna Rada entrusted the duties of the President of Ukraine to its chairman Oleksandr Turchinov 109. On February 24th, ousted President Viktor Yanukovych left Ukraine with unwavering and was taken to Russia 1-3. On February 27th, the former opposition formed a pro-Western government headed by Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Russian President Putin did not accept the Euromaidan that took place in Ukraine 114. In February, March 2014, Russia, under the pretext of protecting the Russian-speaking population, 115, seized and annexed the Ukrainian Crimea and Sevastopol. The annexation of Crimea was not recognized by most countries and was the beginning of an undeclared Russian-Ukrainian War 116. In late February and early March, cities in southern and eastern Ukraine were gripped by socio-political actions in defense of the status of the Russian language under anti-government, federalist, separatist, and pro-Russian slogans. In March 2014, the first wave of mobilization of Ukrainians liable for military service into the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine began to protect the territorial integrity of the country from aggression by Russian hybrid military formations. On April 12, 2014, the first military clashes began in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine between the Ukrainian army and separatist armed groups. Russia, which denied its involvement, also actually participated in the outbreak of war on the side of separatist formations. In the seized building of the regional state administration in Donetsk, the separatists proclaimed the Donetsk People's Republic source not specified 357 days. On April 15th, acting president of Ukraine, Oleksandr Turchinov, launched a military operation against armed separatist groups. On April 28th, the Lugansk People's Republic is proclaimed in Lugansk. On May 12th, after the rigged referendums were held on May 11th, the leadership of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics declared independence. Early presidential elections in Ukraine were held on May 25th. A total of 23 candidates participated in the elections. Petro Poroshenko won the first round with 54.7% of the vote. After Euromaidan on August 25th, President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko prematurely terminated the powers of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine of the 7th convocation. Early parliamentary elections are scheduled for October 26, 2014. Early parliamentary elections were held in Ukraine on October 26, 2014. As a result of the elections to the Verkhovna Rada, a new pro-Western coalition was formed, controlling more than half of the parliamentary seats. The elections were held against the background of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. On November 27, 2014, the Rada elected Volodymyr Groysman as chairman and approved Arseniy Yatsenyuk's candidacy for the post of Prime Minister of Ukraine, instructing him to form a government by December 2nd. The Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has approved the program of the Yatsenyuk government. The adopted program implied the implementation of reforms in various areas, as well as changes in the social security system, in particular, the abolition of ineffective benefits and the taxation of high pensions. The public sector was planned to be reduced by 10. It was also planned to abandon Ukraine's non-aligned status and introduce NATO standards. Annual spending on defense and law enforcement agencies was planned to increase to 5% of GDP, from 8% in 2014. On February 11th at 12, 2015, at a summit in Minsk, the leaders of Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia in the Normandy 4 format signed the Contact Group for the Settlement of the Situation in Ukraine, consisting of representatives of Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, and the unrecognized Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Later, the Minsk agreements were approved by a special resolution of the UN Security Council. On April 10, 2016, Arseniy Yatsenyuk announced that he was resigning from the post of Prime Minister of Ukraine. Yatsenyuk's resignation was approved in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on April 14th. The government of Volodymyr Groysman was formed on April 14, 2016, after the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine of the 8th Convocation approved the candidacy of Volodymyr Groysman for the post of Prime Minister. On May 17, 2017, the leadership of Ukraine and the EU signed a document on the introduction of a visa-free regime for Ukrainians to enter Europe. The solemn signing of the act took place during President Poroshenko's working visit to the European Parliament. The introduction of a visa-free regime has granted Ukrainians the right to move freely on the territory of 30 states. On February 28, 2018, the law of Ukraine on the fundamentals of state language policy, adopted in 2012, was declared unconstitutional and became invalid. On December 10, 2018, Poroshenko signed a law on the termination of the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership with the Russian Federation, in connection with Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. The agreement was terminated on April 1, 2019. On December 15, 2018, a unification council was held in Kiev with the participation of President Poroshenko, the participants of which mainly represented the UOCKP, at which a new church structure was created, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. In the spring of 2019, the law of Ukraine on ensuring the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language was adopted. He consolidated the obligation and predominance of the Ukrainian language in a number of spheres of public life in the country, in particular in the service sector. On March 31, 2019, in accordance with the resolution of the Verkhovna Rada, the first round of elections was held. Volodymyr Zelensky became the leader of the vote, but since he failed to gain more than 50 of the vote, a second round was scheduled, where he met with Petro Poroshenko. On April 21st, the second round of elections took place. According to the results of processing 100 of the ballots, Zelensky won the majority of votes, 73-23. The current President Poroshenko admitted defeat. On May 20th, the inauguration ceremony took place in the building of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, during which Vladimir Zelensky took the oath of office as head of state. During the inauguration, Volodymyr Zelensky announced the dissolution of the Verkhovna Rada. and called on members of the government to vacate their seats for those who will think about the next generations and not about the next elections. Early elections to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine of the 90th Convocation were held by decree of President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky on July 21, 2019. These elections to the Verkhovna Rada were characterized by the lowest turnout in the entire history of Ukraine. For the first time in the history of independent Ukraine, one party has been granted the right to form a government on its own. 226 deputies are needed to form a government, and 300 to amend the constitution. On August 29, 2019, at a solemn meeting of the parliament, the MPs were sworn in. On the same day, the Verkhovna Rada approved Oleksiy Honcharuk for the post of Prime Minister of Ukraine, and also formed a new Honcharuk government. On September 3, 2019, the Verkhovna Rada supported in the second reading, and in general the bill on the abolition of the immunity of people's deputies. Thus, 2 paragraphs are deleted from Article 80 of the Constitution, stating that deputies are guaranteed immunity and cannot be prosecuted without the consent of the Verkhovna Rada. Parliamentary immunity has been abolished since January 1, 2020. On September 7th, a 35 by 35 exchange of detainees took place between Ukraine and Russia, and the Ukrainian sailors captured by Russia in the Kerch Strait incident, film director Oleg Sentsov, and many others were returned. On November 12th, after much delay, the last condition preventing the holding of the summit in the Normandy format was finally fulfilled. The parties to the conflict in Donbass have successfully deployed troops in the last pilot area near the village of Petrovskoye. Meanwhile, Kiev stated that Zelensky's main task during the planned meeting should be to review the Minsk agreements, taking into account the point of view of the Ukrainian patriotic community. On November 15th, it was announced that the Normandy Format Summit would be held on December 9th in Paris. The summit, held at the Élysée Palace, was the first meeting of the leaders in the Normandy format since 2016. The first bilateral meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky also took place during the summit. After agreeing and signing the final communiqué, the Normandy Four held a joint press conference. The Russian invasion, on February 24, 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, carried out from the territory of Russia, the annexed Crimea, and Belarus. The events were preceded by the concentration of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border and the crisis in relations between Russia and Ukraine. On February 21st, Russia recognized the independence of the previously unrecognized Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Numerous warnings about the impending invasion have been published in the media since October 2021, but Russian top officials have consistently denied these statements. On the morning of February 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued an appeal on the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin uses the false image of Ukraine as a neo-Nazi state to justify the invasion. According to the Ukrainian leadership, the main goal of Putin's actions is the elimination of Ukraine as a state. Almost immediately after the start of the war, Ukraine announced the severance of diplomatic relations with Russia. In connection with the outbreak of hostilities, President Volodymyr Zelensky declared martial law on the territory of Ukraine, and on February 25th, general mobilization. According to the UN on August 21st, at least 5,587 civilians have been killed, and at least 7,890 injured since the beginning of the invasion, with real losses estimated to be much higher source, not specified 846 days. Hundreds of houses have been destroyed or damaged. The city of Volnovakha was almost completely destroyed. According to the UN and international humanitarian organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, Russian troops are launching indiscriminate rocket attacks on residential areas, hospitals, and other social infrastructure facilities in Ukraine. Strikes on residential areas in the DPR and LPR with the death of civilians are also recorded. A difficult humanitarian situation is developing in some localities of Ukraine, for example, in Mariupol, which is besieged by Russian troops. The invasion caused a major migration crisis. According to the UN, 8 million refugees left Ukraine as of May 29th, and about 8 million more people became internally displaced as of May 3rd. Source not specified 846 days. A number of journalists called the invasion the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of World War II. The invasion also caused a dramatic drop in Ukraine's GDP, the collapse of foreign trade, the shutdown of air and sea transport, the almost complete destruction of the military industry, a sharp reduction in wages in the private sector, and many other negative economic consequences. Russia's actions have been strongly condemned by most countries of the world community and international organizations. The UN General Assembly Resolution ES-111, supported by the overwhelming majority of the world's countries, condemned Russia's actions and called on it to withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine. A number of experts note that the resistance of the armed forces of Ukraine turned out to be much stronger than expected, which led to a prolongation of the war. At the same time, doubts are expressed about the chances of the Ukrainian troops to win in a clash with the Russian army. At the same time, some experts note that the Russian army was unable to achieve its goals in the early days of the conflict, is experiencing logistical problems, and also has low morale. At the peak of its advance, in March, the Russian Federation occupied about 27% of Ukraine's territory, along with Donbass and Crimea, but by December of the same year, this figure had dropped to 18%. After the Russian army failed to achieve its initial goal of capturing Kiev and ousting the Ukrainian leadership, Russian troops were withdrawn from the Zhytomyr, Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions of Ukraine. After 2 successful Ukrainian counteroffensives, in the Kharkiv region in September and in the Kherson region in November 2022, the invasion effectively turned into a war of attrition. On September 23-27, Russia held fictitious referendums in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and on September 30th, it announced the annexation of 4 partially occupied regions, which have not received international recognition. Currently, most of the Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, as well as a small part of the Kharkiv region, remain occupied. Ukraine has lost access to the Sea of Azov. The report of the human rights organization Human Rights Watch Education Under Occupation, released in June 2024, states that educational institutions located in that territory are subject to forced Russification. The Russian authorities have taken and continue to take measures to eradicate the Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian children deported to Russia are also subjected to Russification. Ukrainian language literature is also being destroyed in the occupied territories. Joining the European Union. On February 28, 2022, Ukraine officially applied for EU membership. The relevant document was signed by President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky. On March 7th, the European Commission began reviewing the application. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said she would speed up the process as much as possible. En presumissão que Kievan Rus.